The woman in the cellar had been screaming for 3 days, but no one came, until tonight. In 1882, Caleb Turner bought a mountain ranch for a fresh start. His first night alone should have been peaceful. Instead, a woman's desperate cry shattered the frozen silence, echoing from the neighbor's locked cellar. What he found chained below would force him to choose: walk away like everyone else, or risk everything for a stranger. This is the story of how one act of courage destroyed a powerful man, saved a broken woman, and built a legacy that would outlast them both. Stay until the end, hit that like button, and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels. The stagecoach left Caleb Turner at the crossroads just after dawn, his belongings piled in the dirt beside him like the scattered pieces of a life he was trying to rebuild. 26 years old, lean from hard work and harder years, he stood there watching the coach disappear into the mountain pass, the dust settling around his boots like a question he wasn't sure he could answer. Colorado stretched before him in shades of gold and shadow, aspens burning yellow against the dark spine of the Rockies, the air so crisp it hurt to breathe. September 1882, and already the nights were dropping toward freezing. Winter would come early this high up, the locals had warned him. But Caleb hadn't come to Colorado for comfort. He'd come to disappear. The ranch deed sat folded in his coat pocket, purchased sight unseen through a land agent in Denver, with almost every dollar he'd saved from 5 years of cowboy work across Wyoming and Montana. 300 acres, a cabin, a barn, water rights to the creek that ran through the valley. The agent had been suspiciously eager to close the deal, which should have warned Caleb something was wrong. But desperate men don't ask too many questions, and Caleb had been desperate to get far away from the memories that followed him like ghosts. He shouldered his pack, grabbed his rifle, and started walking. The road, if you could call it that, wound through pine forests so dense the sunlight barely touched the ground. His boots crunched on pine needles and frozen earth. 2 miles in, the trees opened up and he got his first real look at the valley below. His valley now. It was beautiful in a stark, lonely way. The cabin sat in a meadow surrounded by forest, with the creek running silver through the grass. The barn needed work. He could see even from this distance that the roof was half collapsed. The fences were down in places, and what should have been pasture land had gone wild with sagebrush and scrub. But it was his. That mattered more than the work it would take. What caught his attention, though, was the neighboring property to the east. Where his land looked neglected, that ranch was pristine. White-painted fences, a substantial 2-story house, outbuildings in perfect repair. Smoke rose from the chimney. Horses grazed in a manicured paddock. Someone with money lived there, which made Caleb wonder why they'd let the adjoining property fall to ruin before selling it to a stranger. He filed the question away and kept walking. The cabin was worse up close. The door hung crooked on leather hinges, and when Caleb pushed it open, mice scattered from the corners. But the roof was solid, the stone fireplace intact, and the single window still had glass. He'd slept in worse places, line shacks in Wyoming winter, the ground beneath cattle drives, that jail cell in Cheyenne he tried not to think about. He spent the day making the place livable, swept out the debris, checked the chimney, repaired the door as best he could with the tools he'd brought. When the light started failing, he built a fire and cooked the last of the salt pork he'd carried from Denver, washing it down with creek water so cold it made his teeth ache. As darkness fell, the silence settled over the valley like something physical. Caleb had grown up with silence, raised on a hardscrabble farm in Missouri where his father's anger filled the spaces between words, where speaking up meant a beating, where he'd learned early that quiet was safer than questions. He'd left at 16, worked his way west doing whatever paid, and found he preferred the company of cattle and horses to most people. Silence had been his companion for a decade. But this silence was different. It was too complete, too heavy, pressing against the cabin walls like it was trying to get in. He told himself it was just the elevation, the unfamiliar sounds of a new place. He fed the fire and tried to sleep. The scream came just after midnight. Caleb jerked awake, his hand already reaching for the rifle beside him. For a moment he thought he'd dreamed it. The cry had been distant, distorted by wind and space. He lay there in the darkness, his heart hammering, listening. Nothing. Just the pop of settling logs in the fireplace, the whisper of wind through the pines. He was lowering the rifle when it came again. "Help! A woman's voice, raw with desperation, echoing across the valley from somewhere to the east, toward that pristine neighboring ranch. "Please, someone help me!" Caleb was on his feet before conscious thought caught up, pulling on his boots, grabbing his coat. Every instinct he'd developed over years of surviving told him to stay inside, to mind his own business, that getting involved in other people's trouble was how good intentions turned into graves. But that voice, God, that voice! He'd heard men scream before, seen them trampled under stampedes, crushed by horses, shot in gunfights and knife fights, and all the stupid ways men found to hurt each other. But there was something in this woman's cry that bypassed reason entirely, something primal that spoke directly to whatever piece of himself he'd tried to bury under layers of indifference. Someone was in trouble. Real trouble. He stepped out into the night. The cold hit him like a fist. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees since sunset, and frost was already forming on the grass. The moon was 3 days from full, bright enough to cast shadows, turning the valley into a landscape of silver and black. His breath plumed in the air as he started toward the neighboring property, the rifle comfortable in his hands. The screaming had stopped, but that somehow made it worse. The fence line between the properties was marked by fallen posts and rusted wire. Caleb climbed through carefully, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, searching for movement. The big house sat maybe a quarter-mile away, its windows dark. No lights, no signs of life. But something drew him past the house toward the cluster of outbuildings beyond. A barn, a smokehouse, what looked like a root cellar built into the hillside. There. He saw it in the moonlight, a wooden door set into the earth at an angle, the kind of cellar entrance common for storing vegetables and preserves through the winter. But this door had been reinforced with iron bands, and a heavy chain was wrapped around the handle, secured with a padlock, locked from the outside. Caleb's stomach turned to ice. He approached slowly, his boots silent on the frozen ground. As he got closer, he could hear it. Breathing. Fast, panicked breathing from inside the cellar, and the sound of someone moving in confined space. "Hello?" he called softly. The breathing stopped. For a heartbeat, nothing. Then, "Oh God. Oh God, please, please help me." The voice was hoarse, breaking. "Please, he locked me in here, please." "I'm going to get you out," Caleb said, his voice steadier than he felt. "Stay calm. I need to break this lock. Hurry, please hurry. I can't breathe." Caleb examined the chain in the moonlight. The padlock was new, solid iron. He could shoot it off, but the noise would wake everyone within a mile. Instead, he looked around, found a heavy rock near the woodpile, and used it to hammer at the hasp. The sound rang across the valley like a bell. "What are you doing?" the woman called from below, her voice sharp with fear. "He'll hear you." "Can't be helped," Caleb grunted, striking again. The metal bent but held. "Who locked you in?" "Who did this?" "Harold, my stepfather. He'll kill you if he finds you here." The hasp broke on the fourth strike. Caleb tore the chain away and hauled the door open. The smell that rolled out made him step back. Human waste, rot, and beneath it all, the metallic scent of blood. He pulled a match from his pocket, struck it against his boot. The light flared, and he saw her. She was huddled in the far corner of the cellar, maybe 8 feet below ground level, her dress torn and filthy, her dark hair matted against her skull. Her face was gaunt, eyes too large in her hollow cheeks, and her wrists were raw and bleeding where rope had been tied. How long had those ropes held her before she'd worked free? "Can you climb up?" Caleb asked, forcing his voice to stay level. She tried to stand and immediately collapsed, her legs unable to hold her weight. "I'm coming down," he said, and jumped into the cellar before fear could stop him. Up close, she was worse than he'd thought. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin fevered beneath its layer of dirt. She couldn't have been more than 22, 23, younger than him, but suffering had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with years. "How long?" he asked. I don't know. Weeks? 3 weeks, maybe? I stopped counting." Her voice was barely a whisper. "There's water down here in the corner. He put a bucket, but no food for days now. Maybe a week." Caleb felt rage building in his chest, hot and dangerous. "Can you hold on to me? I need to lift you out." She nodded. and when he crouched down, she wrapped her skeletal arms around his neck. She weighed almost nothing, couldn't have been more than 90 pounds, and he lifted her like a child, carrying her to the wall beneath the opening. "There's a ladder," she whispered. He took it, said I'd never need it again. "We don't need his ladder," Caleb said. He braced himself against the earthen wall, got his feet under him, and pushed upward with everything he had. His shoulders cleared the opening, then his waist. He twisted, got his elbows on solid ground, and pulled them both out into the freezing night. She gasped when the cold air hit her, then started coughing, deep, racking coughs that shook her entire frame. Caleb shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "We need to move," he said quietly, "before someone comes." "He's gone," she managed between coughs. "Harold. He left yesterday morning for Denver. Business. Said he'd be back in 4 days. He thought—" her voice broke. "He thought I'd be dead by then." The casual cruelty of it, leaving someone to starve to death in a locked cellar like an animal, made Caleb's hands shake. He'd seen evil before, the ordinary cruelty men were capable of, but this was different. This was calculated. Patient. "Can you walk?" he asked. She tried, but her legs buckled immediately. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground. "Right," he said. "I'm carrying you then." He lifted her again, ignoring her weak protests, and started back toward his property. She weighed so little it was obscene, just bones and skin and the terrible trembling of someone who'd been pushed to the absolute edge of survival. Behind them, the cellar door hung open like an accusing mouth. They crossed the fence line in silence, the woman's breathing shallow against his chest. Halfway to the cabin, she started shaking so hard he thought she might be seizing, but it was just the cold working its way through her body. He held her tighter and walked faster. The cabin's warmth hit them like a blessing. Caleb kicked the door shut behind them and carried her to the rough bed in the corner, just a wooden frame with a straw mattress, but infinitely better than an earthen floor. He laid her down gently and built up the fire until flames roared up the chimney. "Water," she whispered. "Please." He had a canteen and he held it to her cracked lips, letting her drink slowly. She tried to gulp it down, but he pulled it back. "Easy," he said. "Not too fast or you'll be sick." She nodded, understanding, and he let her drink again. A little more this time. Her eyes never left his face, searching, evaluating, still wary despite her desperation. Smart, he thought. After what she'd been through, trust wouldn't come easy. When she'd had enough water, he stepped back, giving her space. "I'm Caleb Turner," he said. "I just bought the property next to yours. Got here today." "Eliza," she said hoarsely. "Eliza Monroe." Her eyes drifted to the fire, then back to him. "You shouldn't have helped me. When Harold finds out—" "Let me worry about Harold," Caleb said. The anger was still there, banked now, but ready to flare. "Right now, we need to get you cleaned up and fed. When did you last eat?" "I don't remember." She looked down at her hands, at the rope burns encircling her wrists. He stopped bringing food. Said there was no point. Said I'd chosen my fate, and now I could live with it. Or die with it. "What did you choose?" Caleb asked quietly. "What made him do this to you?" Eliza's laugh was bitter, broken. "I said no." The story came out in fragments over the next hour, between sips of water and bites of the bread Caleb had saved from Denver. Her mother had died 2 years ago, leaving her alone with Harold Monroe, her stepfather, a man who'd married her mother for her small inheritance and stayed for the respectability it brought. Harold owned the ranch, ran a freighting business in Denver, and had built his life on an image of propriety that Eliza's very existence threatened. "He wanted me to marry," she said, her voice hollow. "Samuel Blackwood. He owns half the freight contracts in Denver. 47 years old, already buried 2 wives. Harold said it would secure our family's future." She spat the words like poison. "He meant it would secure his business interest. Samuel would give him contracts, money, connections. All I had to do was say yes." "So you said no," Caleb finished. "I said no," she confirmed. "I told him I wouldn't be sold like livestock, that I'd rather die than marry a man I didn't love. A man old enough to be my father." Her eyes met Caleb's, fierce despite the exhaustion. "He took me at my word." Locked me in that cellar and said when I got hungry enough, I'd change my mind. When I didn't, he just stopped coming. Caleb felt that rage again, colder now, harder. Where's the rest of your family? Someone who could— There's no one, Eliza interrupted. My mother's family disowned her when she married my father. He was poor, Irish, not good enough for their Boston blood. They all died in the war anyway, and my father— Her voice softened with old grief. Died when I was 8. Mining accident. Harold's all I have. All I had. She looked around the rough cabin, at the gaps in the chinking, the dirt floor, the sparse furnishings. This isn't your problem, she said quietly. You don't know me. You don't owe me anything. If you'll just let me rest tonight, I'll leave in the morning. Leave and go where? Caleb asked. You can barely stand. You've got no money, no food, and winter's coming. Harold will just drag you back. Then what would you have me do? There was desperation in her voice now. Desperation and something like anger. I have no legal standing. I'm unmarried, under 25, which means Harold is my legal guardian. The law says I'm his property until I marry or come of age. If I run, he can bring me back. If I fight, I lose. That's why he was so sure the cellar would work, because even if someone found me, even if someone cared, there's nothing anyone could do. She was right, and they both knew it. The law in 1882 didn't favor women, especially young women without money or family. A stepfather's authority was absolute. Even if Caleb went to the marshal in town, assuming there was a marshal, Harold could claim Eliza was hysterical, unstable, that he'd locked her up for her own protection. Men like Harold, men with money and reputation, didn't face consequences for what they did to their own families, unless someone made them. You'll stay here, Caleb said, his voice leaving no room for argument. At least until you're strong enough to decide what comes next. My property, my rules. Harold wants you back. He'll have to go through me. Eliza stared at him like he'd spoken a foreign language. You don't understand. Harold isn't just cruel. He's powerful. He has friends, money, influence. He'll destroy you. He can try, Caleb said simply. Won't be the first time someone's tried to destroy me. I'm still here. Something in his tone made Eliza study him more carefully. She saw the scars on his knuckles, the way he carried himself. Not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of someone who'd survived things most people couldn't imagine. His eyes were gray, steady, and when they met hers, she saw no pity, just determination. Why? She asked. Why would you risk everything for a stranger? Caleb was quiet for a long moment, feeding another log into the fire. When he spoke, his voice was low. I had a sister once, younger than me. Pretty girl, sweet-natured. Our father was not a good man, drank too much, hit too hard. I tried to protect her, but I was just a kid. He stared into the flames. When I was 15, he arranged for her to marry a man from the next county, 50 years old, mean drunk. Everyone knew it. She was 13. Eliza's breath caught. She begged me to help her run away, Caleb continued. But I was scared. Scared of our father, scared of the law, scared of what would happen if we got caught. So I told her to do what she was told her it would be fine, that she'd be safe. He turned to look at Eliza, and she saw old pain in his eyes. She hanged herself 2 days before the wedding. I found her in the barn. Oh, God, Eliza whispered. I left that night, Caleb said. Haven't been back since. Told myself I'd never stand by and watch someone suffer again, never be too scared to do what's right. He met her eyes. You asked me why. That's why. I couldn't save my sister, but I can damn well save you. The cabin fell silent except for the crackling fire. Eliza felt tears burning in her eyes, the first tears she'd allowed herself since Harold had thrown her into that cellar. Not tears of grief or fear, but something else. Something she thought she'd lost forever. Hope. I don't know how to thank you, she said finally. Don't thank me yet, Caleb replied. We've got a long fight ahead if you want to stay free. Harold won't give up easy. I know. Eliza straightened despite her exhaustion, and Caleb saw the steel beneath her fragility. But I'm not going back. I'd rather die free than live as his prisoner. Then we'll make sure it doesn't come to dying, Caleb said. For now, you need rest. Take the bed. I'll sleep by the fire. Eliza wanted to protest, but her body was already betraying her, exhaustion pulling her down like a physical weight. She lay back on the rough mattress, Caleb's coat still wrapped around her shoulders, and felt sleep rushing up to claim her. Just before darkness took her, she heard Caleb's voice, quiet but firm. You're safe now. I promise you that. Whatever comes, you're safe. And for the first time in 3 weeks, maybe for the first time in years, Eliza Monroe believed it. Outside, the Colorado night deepened. The stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human suffering, while frost crept across the valley floor like searching fingers. In the big house on the neighboring property, the empty rooms waited for Harold Monroe's return. But in the small cabin, a fire burned warm against the darkness, and 2 broken people had found something neither expected, a reason to fight. Dawn came cold and gray, the sun struggling through clouds that promised snow before nightfall. Caleb woke to find Eliza still sleeping, her breathing finally steady and deep. He fed the fire quietly, made coffee from the last of his supplies, and stepped outside to assess the situation he'd gotten himself into. The land looked different in daylight. His 300 acres stretched before him, meadow and forest, creek and sky, beautiful and demanding in equal measure. The barn needed immediate attention, the fences would take weeks to repair, and winter was maybe 6 weeks out. Under normal circumstances, that would be challenge enough. But circumstances had stopped being normal the moment he'd heard that scream. He was standing by the creek, planning his next move, when he heard the cabin door open. Eliza emerged slowly, still wrapped in his coat, her dark hair loose around her shoulders. In the morning light, he could see the full extent of what Harold had done to her. The hollows in her cheeks, the bruises on her arms, the way she moved like someone half convinced the ground might give way beneath her feet. But she was standing. That counted for something. There's coffee, Caleb said, keeping his voice casual. Not much else, I'm afraid. I need to get to town for supplies. Town, Eliza repeated, something flickering in her eyes. You mean Copper Creek? That's the closest settlement? 8 miles east. She walked toward him slowly, testing her legs. Harold owns the general store there, and the feed and tack, and he's on the town council. She looked up at him. Everyone knows him. Everyone respects him. If you go there asking questions, word will get back to him before you make it home. Caleb absorbed this, his jaw tightening. I still need supplies. We both do. Food, medicine, warm clothes for you. I have clothes, Eliza interrupted. At the house. If we're careful, if we're quick, I could— No. The word came out harder than Caleb intended. You're not going back there. Not now. Not ever. It's just a house. It's his house, Caleb said. And until I know exactly what we're dealing with, I'm not taking chances. He saw the frustration in her face and softened his tone. Look, I know you're not helpless. I know you're stronger than you look right now, but you've been starved for weeks and Harold could come back anytime. Let's think this through. Eliza was quiet for a moment, then nodded reluctantly. You're right. I'm sorry. I'm just not used to someone else making decisions about my safety. Fair enough, Caleb said. So let's make them together. What do we need most urgently? They spent the next hour planning. Eliza needed food, proper rest, and medicine if possible. She was fighting off a fever from her time in the cellar, and her cough was getting worse. Caleb needed to secure the cabin before winter, which meant tools, nails, proper supplies. And they both needed information about Harold's plans, his timeline, his allies. He keeps records, Eliza said suddenly. In his study. Ledgers, correspondence, contracts. If you wanted to know his business dealings, his connections, you'd find it there. You want me to break into his house? Caleb asked. I want us to know what we're facing, Eliza replied. Harold doesn't make moves without planning them first. If we can see his correspondence, we'll know if he's already set something in motion. A marriage contract with Samuel, maybe? Or legal papers to have me declared incompetent. She met Caleb's eyes. Information is the only weapon I have. The only weapon we have. She was right again. Caleb might be handy in a fight, but this wasn't a fight he could win with his fists. This was about law, money, social power, things Harold had in abundance and they lacked entirely. How well do you know the house layout? He asked. I grew up there. I know every room, every hiding place. Eliza's voice grew stronger as she spoke. The study is on the first floor, east side. Window faces the meadow. Harold keeps it locked, but I know where he hides the key. And if someone's there? Servants? Hired hands? Harold gave everyone time off while he's in Denver, Eliza said. He didn't want anyone around to hear me screaming. The bitterness in her voice was sharp as glass. We'd have the place to ourselves. It was risky. If Harold came back early, if someone saw them, if any of a dozen things went wrong, this could end very badly. But doing nothing was riskier. Caleb had learned long ago that in a fight between the powerful and the powerless, surprise and information were often the only advantages you got. Tonight then, he decided. After dark. In and out fast. Eliza nodded, something like relief crossing her face. Thank you for trusting me, for believing this matters. It matters, Caleb said simply. They spent the day preparing. Caleb worked on the cabin, reinforcing the door, checking the window, making sure they had defensible positions if things went wrong. Eliza rested, ate what little food they had, and slowly regained some of her strength. By afternoon, the fever in her eyes had faded, and though she was still weak, she could walk without stumbling. As the sun set, painting the valley in shades of amber and shadow, they made their final plans. We stick together, Caleb said. You lead the way. I watch our backs. We get what we need and leave. No heroics, no risks. Agreed? Agreed, Eliza said. They waited until full dark, then crossed the fence line again. The valley was silent except for wind through the pines and the distant call of an owl. The big house rose before them, its windows black and empty, and Caleb felt the hair rise on the back of his neck. Which window? He whispered. Eliza pointed to the east side. Caleb tried it carefully, locked. He pulled his knife and worked the blade into the gap between sash and frame, lifting slowly. The lock gave with a soft click. They climbed through into Harold's study. The room smelled of tobacco and old leather. Moonlight through the window illuminated a heavy desk, floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, a safe set into the wall. Eliza moved to the desk with confidence born of familiarity, pulling open drawers, finding the ledgers she'd mentioned. Here, she whispered, opening the topmost book. Caleb struck a match, shielding the flame, and they read by its flickering light. What they found made his blood run cold. Harold Monroe wasn't just a freight company owner. He was involved in land speculation, mining investments, and, most damning, a scheme to acquire neighboring properties at below-market rates through intimidation and legal manipulation. Caleb's ranch was on a list of targets, marked with notes about water rights and railway access. And there, in Harold's own handwriting, E will capitulate or be eliminated, either outcome acceptable. Eliminated. He was going to kill you, Caleb said quietly. The cellar wasn't just punishment. He was going to let you die. I know, Eliza whispered. I've known for weeks. They found more. Correspondence with Samuel Blackwood discussing the marriage arrangement, letters from lawyers about guardianship law, even a draft will leaving Harold's entire estate to Samuel in the event of Eliza's death. It was all there, a complete picture of calculated cruelty. Caleb was about to suggest they leave when Eliza found something else. A telegram, dated 5 days ago, from Denver. Marriage contract finalized, arriving September 28 with Blackwood. Matter will be resolved. September 28th, 2 days from now. He's bringing Samuel here, Eliza said, her voice shaking. He's going to force me to marry him. Over my dead body, Caleb said. That might be the plan, Eliza replied. They gathered what evidence they could carry, the ledger, the correspondence, the telegram, and climbed back out the window. Behind them, Harold's study waited in darkness, its secrets partially exposed. But as they crossed the meadow back toward Caleb's cabin, neither of them saw the rider watching from the tree line, a man on a dark horse, motionless in the shadows, who'd seen everything and was already turning his mount back toward the road to Denver. Harold Monroe had left watchers after all, and the message they carried would reach him by morning. The rider reached Denver before dawn, his horse lathered and blowing hard from the night ride. He found Harold Monroe in his suite at the Continental Hotel, already dressed for breakfast despite the early hour. The news he delivered made Harold's face darken with a rage so cold it froze the temperature in the room. "You're certain?" Harold asked, his voice dangerously quiet. "Saw them both, sir. The new neighbor and Miss Eliza came through the study window, took papers from your desk, left together heading west." Harold dismissed the man with a curt nod and 5 gold coins, then stood at the window watching the sun rise over Denver's rooftops. So Eliza had found an ally, some fool cowboy who thought he could play hero. Harold had seen it before, young men with more courage than sense, thinking they could stand against money and power with nothing but good intentions. They always learned otherwise, usually too late. He pulled his watch from his vest pocket. 26 hours until he and Samuel were scheduled to leave for the ranch. But plans could change, would change. If this cowboy thought he could interfere in Harold Monroe's affairs, he was about to discover exactly how expensive that mistake could be. Harold rang for his secretary and began dictating telegrams. Back at the cabin, Caleb and Eliza spread the stolen documents across the rough table, trying to make sense of what they'd found. The morning sun streamed through the window, illuminating pages of carefully recorded cruelty, evidence of Harold's schemes, his manipulation, the cold calculation with which he'd planned to dispose of his stepdaughter. "We need to take this to the law," Caleb said. "A marshal, a judge, someone—" "And tell them what?" Eliza interrupted, her voice sharp with frustration. "That my stepfather locked me in a cellar? He'll say I'm lying, that I'm mentally unstable, that he was protecting me from myself. Who do you think they'll believe? A hysterical woman with no money and no family? Or Harold Monroe, respected businessman and town benefactor? But we have evidence. We have stolen papers that prove Harold is ruthless in business, which everyone already knows. They prove he wanted me to marry Samuel, which isn't illegal. They prove he thought I'd capitulate or be eliminated, which he'll say was metaphorical." Eliza's hands shook as she sorted through the documents. "Don't you see? This proves Harold is a terrible person, but it doesn't prove he committed any crime the law would care about." Caleb wanted to argue, but he knew she was right. He'd seen how justice worked when money was involved. Had seen it in Cheyenne, when a wealthy rancher's son had beaten a man half to death and walked free because his father owned the judge. Had seen it in Montana, when a mine owner worked men to death and called it unfortunate accidents. The law protected property and power. Everything else was negotiable. "Then we make him care about something else," Caleb said slowly. "We make this public. If we can't beat him in court, we beat him in the court of public opinion." "How?" Eliza asked. "You said Harold's business depends on reputation, on respectability. What if people knew what he really is? What if the good citizens of Copper Creek and Denver heard how he treated his own stepdaughter?" Eliza considered this, hope and doubt warring in her expression. "Harold controls the newspaper in Copper Creek, and he has friends at the Denver papers. Any story we tried to tell would be buried or twisted before it saw print." "Not if enough people were talking about it first," Caleb said. "Not if it became a scandal too big to suppress. Churches, women's societies, business associations. If we can get the story to the right people, make them care, Harold won't be able to silence everyone." It was a long shot, but it was something. Better than hiding and hoping Harold would just give up. They were still planning when they heard the horse approaching. Caleb grabbed his rifle instinctively, moving to the window. A single rider was coming up the path from the road. A woman, he realized, riding side saddle on a gray mare. She was dressed well, but practically, with a determined set to her shoulders that said she was used to getting where she was going despite obstacles. "Do you know her?" Caleb asked. Eliza came to the window, and her face lit with recognition and relief. "Ruth Callahan. She runs the boarding house in Copper Creek. She was friends with my mother." They watched as Ruth dismounted, tied her horse, and approached the cabin with the brisk efficiency of someone on a mission. Caleb opened the door before she could knock. "Mrs. Callahan," Eliza said, stepping forward. "Eliza Monroe, you look like death warmed over," Ruth said bluntly, but her eyes were warm with concern. She was perhaps 45, with iron gray hair pulled severely back and eyes that missed nothing. "I came as soon as I heard." "Heard what?" Caleb asked. "That Harold's stepdaughter had been found at the new neighbor's place, weak and half-starved." Ruth looked at Caleb appraisingly. You'd be Turner then. Bought the old Hendricks ranch. Word travels fast, Caleb said carefully. In a town of 300 souls, everything travels fast, Ruth replied. She turned back to Eliza. Sarah Hendricks, Tom's widow. She was in the store yesterday when that rider came through headed for Denver. Heard him bragging in the saloon about earning 5 gold coins for a night's ride. Got him drunk enough to talk about what he'd seen. Her expression hardened. You breaking into Harold's study, taking papers. Figured I should come see the truth of it myself. Eliza's face paled. If Sarah knows, then half the town knows by now, Ruth confirmed, which means Harold will know within hours if he doesn't already. That's why I'm here. Whatever you're planning, you need to do it fast. Caleb made coffee while Ruth examined Eliza with the practiced eye of someone who'd nursed sick boarders through everything from influenza to gunshot wounds. Her questions were direct and her judgment swift. He starved you, Ruth said flatly after hearing the full story. Locked you in that cellar and left you to die because you wouldn't marry his business partner. Yes, Eliza confirmed. Ruth's face could have been carved from granite. And you have proof of this? They showed her the documents. Ruth read through them methodically, her lips pressed into a thin line. When she finished, she looked up at both of them. This won't be enough for the marshal, she said, echoing Eliza's earlier assessment. Tom Henderson is Harold's man through and through. Got his position because Harold backed him. Won't move against his patron no matter what we show him. Then what do we do? Eliza asked. Ruth was quiet for a moment, thinking. There's a circuit judge comes through twice a year, Judge Morrison. He's honest, doesn't owe Harold anything. If we could get Eliza's testimony in front of him, along with medical evidence of what was done to her. When does he come through? Caleb asked. 3 weeks. 3 weeks. Caleb saw the problem immediately. Harold and Samuel are coming in 2 days. Then we need to make sure they find a situation they can't easily resolve, Ruth said. She looked at Eliza with something like pride. Child, I know you're scared. I know you've been through hell. But if you want to beat Harold at his own game, you need to be strategic. You need allies, witnesses, and you need to be somewhere he can't just drag you off without consequences. Where? Eliza asked. My boarding house, Ruth said simply. It's a public establishment. I've got 6 boarders right now, including a traveling minister and a school teacher from back east. Harold comes storming in trying to take you by force. He'll have a dozen witnesses to answer for. Plus, I can tend to you properly, get you healthy again, and people can see the evidence of what he did before it heals. It made sense, but Caleb felt his instincts rebel against the idea. That puts you in danger, Mrs. Callahan. Harold won't take kindly to someone harboring Eliza. I've dealt with bullies before, Mr. Turner, Ruth said coolly. My late husband used to be one. I learned how to stand my ground. She stood, brushing dust from her skirts. Besides, I knew Eliza's mother, knew what Harold was when he married her, a fortune hunter with a mean streak. I stayed quiet then, didn't interfere, and Margaret paid the price. I won't make that mistake twice. What price? Eliza asked quietly. Ruth hesitated, then sighed. Your mother didn't die of influenza, child. She fell down the stairs. After an argument with Harold about money she'd left in trust for you. I was there the next day, saw the bruises that weren't on her face, bruises where they wouldn't show. Her voice hardened. Town doctor ruled it an accident. I knew better, couldn't prove it, so I kept quiet. Been regretting it ever since. The cabin fell silent. Eliza's face had gone white, and Caleb saw her hands clench into fists. He'd suspected Harold was capable of violence, but this, murdering his own wife for money, this was beyond ordinary cruelty. He killed her, Eliza whispered. He killed my mother. I believe so, Ruth said gently, and I think he was prepared to let you die too. But you're alive, Eliza, and we're going to make sure you stay that way. Eliza nodded slowly, visibly pulling herself together. Caleb watched her spine straighten, saw the fear in her eyes transmute into something harder. Resolve. What do you need me to do? Eliza asked. Come to town with me now, Ruth said. Publicly, openly. We tell people you were ill that I'm caring for you while you recover. We say nothing about cellars or starvation or forced marriages. Not yet. First, we let people see you, let them talk, let curiosity build. Then, when Harold arrives and makes his move, we have witnesses ready. And if he has legal authority to take her, Caleb asked, then we make him use it in front of God and everyone, Ruth replied. Make him show his hand publicly. Force him to either admit what he did or lie about it in front of the whole town. Either way, we create doubt. And doubt is what we need if we want Judge Morrison to listen when he arrives. It was risky, but it was also smart. Harold's power came from operating in private, from making problems disappear quietly. Forcing him into the open, making him act where people could see, might be the only advantage they had. I'll need to stay here, Caleb said. Guard the property, make sure Harold doesn't try anything while we're distracted. Agreed, Ruth said. Besides, people seeing you and Eliza together right now would just fuel the wrong kind of gossip. Better she's with a respectable widow while you maintain a proper distance. Caleb understood the wisdom of it, even as he hated the necessity. In 1882, a young unmarried woman staying alone with a single man was scandal enough to destroy both their reputations, no matter how innocent the circumstances. Ruth's boarding house offered protection that went beyond the physical, but he still didn't like the idea of Eliza being anywhere he couldn't immediately protect her. I'll be fine, Eliza said, reading his expression. She was trying to sound brave, but he could hear the tremor beneath the words. Ruth is right. This is the smart play. Smart doesn't always mean safe, Caleb said. Nothing about this is safe, Eliza replied. But I'm tired of being Harold's victim. If there's a chance to fight back, I have to take it. They gathered what little Eliza needed, Caleb's coat since she had nothing else warm enough, and the documents they'd stolen, which Ruth wrapped carefully in oilcloth. Before they left, Ruth examined Eliza one more time. You're malnourished, fevered, and those rope burns need proper tending, she said. I'll have the doctor look at you, quietly but officially. We'll want his testimony later. Will he help? Eliza asked. Dr. Hayes is getting old and tired of being pushed around by men like Harold, Ruth said. I think he might surprise us. They were at the door when Caleb spoke. Mrs. Callahan, there's something you should know. Harold's planning something for when he arrives. The telegram we found said matter will be resolved. That sounds like he's not planning to negotiate, Ruth finished grimly. Yes, I caught that too. All the more reason to move fast. She looked at Caleb directly. If things go wrong, if Harold makes a move we can't counter, are you prepared to do what's necessary? Yes, Caleb said without hesitation. Ruth studied him for a moment, then nodded. Good. We may need that before this is over. They left together, Ruth and Eliza on the gray mare, Caleb watching from the cabin doorway until they disappeared into the trees. Then he turned back to the empty cabin and began preparing for war. If Harold wanted a fight, Caleb would give him one. The next 2 days passed in tense preparation. Caleb reinforced the cabin's defenses, checked his weapons, and rode into the hills to scout possible approaches to his property. He was used to range work, used to thinking tactically about land and position and cover. If Harold brought men, and Caleb suspected he would, they'd find the old cowboy wasn't as easy a target as they expected. Ruth, meanwhile, worked her own kind of magic in Copper Creek. Within hours of Eliza's arrival at the boarding house, word had spread through town like wildfire. The minister, Reverend Charles Hammond, took one look at Eliza's condition and immediately declared himself her advocate. The schoolteacher, a sharp-eyed Boston woman named Miss Emily Preston, was similarly outraged. I've seen girls in New York factories treated better than this, Emily told Ruth privately. If this is what passes for family in Colorado, I'm ashamed. By evening of the first day, half the women in Copper Creek had found excuses to visit Ruth's boarding house. They brought soup, blankets, knowing looks, and questions that Ruth deflected with practiced skill. Poor child took ill, Ruth told them all. Needs rest and care. Her stepfather's been away on business, you see. Came to me for help. The lie was transparent enough to let imagination fill in the gaps, but vague enough to avoid direct accusation. Within 24 hours, every woman in town was whispering theories, and the men were starting to ask uncomfortable questions. Dr. Hayes came on the second morning. He was 70 if he was a day, with shaking hands and sad eyes that had seen too much suffering. He examined Eliza in Ruth's private parlor with Miss Preston as a witness. Severe malnutrition, he pronounced. Dehydration. Signs of prolonged exposure to cold and damp. These rope burns are at least 2 weeks old, maybe more. And this bruising. He indicated faint marks on Eliza's arms, consistent with someone being forcibly restrained. "Will you put that in writing, doctor?" Ruth asked. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. "You're asking me to make an enemy of Harold Monroe." "I'm asking you to tell the truth," Ruth replied. The old doctor sighed, but he nodded. "I'll write it up. Give it to Judge Morrison when he comes through. That's all I can do." "That's all we're asking," Ruth assured him. Harold and Samuel arrived on the afternoon of the second day, September 28th, just as the clouds that had been threatening finally broke into snow. The first snow of the season, falling soft and white across the valley, coating everything in false purity. They came with 4 hired men, range toughs from Denver with the look of men used to violence. Harold rode at the front, impeccably dressed despite the weather, his face a mask of civilized fury. Samuel Blackwood rode beside him, a heavy-set man with cold eyes and the entitled bearing of someone who'd never been told no in his life. Caleb watched them approach from the cabin window, his rifle loaded and ready. They stopped at the fence line between properties, and Harold called out, "Turner, I know you're in there." Caleb stepped onto the porch, the rifle held casually but ready. "Monroe, you're on my land." "Where is she?" Harold demanded. "Where's Eliza?" "Not here," Caleb said truthfully. "And even if she was, what business is it of yours?" "She's my stepdaughter, you ignorant cowboy. My responsibility, and you've kidnapped her." "Kidnapped?" Caleb let his voice carry disbelief. "That's an interesting way to describe rescuing someone from being locked in a cellar." He saw Harold's face tighten, saw the calculation in his eyes. "So they were doing this publicly then?" "Good." "I don't know what lies she's told you," Harold said, his voice carrying the wounded dignity of the wrongly accused. "But Eliza is unwell, mentally fragile. I was forced to confine her for her own protection, and you've interfered in a family matter that doesn't concern you." "Confine her," Caleb repeated. "That what you call starving someone in the dark?" "I call it mercy," Harold shot back. The girl was hysterical, threatening violence against herself and others. "Would you have preferred I had her committed to an asylum?" "I was trying to spare her that humiliation." It was a good lie, Caleb had to admit. Plausible, even sympathetic. Harold was positioning himself as the concerned guardian forced to make difficult decisions. Against Eliza's word alone, it might even work. But Eliza wasn't alone anymore. "Where is she, Turner?" Samuel spoke for the first time, his voice like gravel. "She belongs with her family. With me." "With you?" Caleb asked. "And what claim do you have on Miss Monroe?" Samuel's smile was ugly. "Harold and I have an arrangement. Eliza will be my wife. The papers are already drawn up. All that remains is her signature, or her guardian's permission, which I already have." "Except she's not property you can trade," Caleb said quietly. "She's a person, and persons get to choose." "Not under the law," Harold said, and now his voice had gone cold. "Eliza is unmarried, under 25, which makes her my legal ward. I have the right to approve her marriage. I have approved this marriage, and you, Mr. Turner, are interfering in legal family business." "Then take it to the marshal," Caleb suggested. "I intend to." Harold gestured, and 2 of his hired men started to dismount. "In the meantime, I'll be searching your property for my missing stepdaughter." "Not without a warrant, you won't," Caleb said, and the rifle came up to his shoulder. "And not without going through me." The tension ratcheted immediately. The hired men froze, hands moving toward their own weapons. Harold's face flushed with genuine anger now, the mask slipping. "You're threatening me?" he asked, disbelief and rage mixing in his voice. "I'm defending my property," Caleb said calmly. "You want to search my land, get legal authority. Until then, you and your friends can turn around and ride back the way you came." For a moment, Caleb thought it would turn into a gunfight right there. He could see Harold calculating, weighing the cost of forcing the issue. 4 armed men against 1 cowboy should have been easy odds. But something in Caleb's eyes, the steadiness of someone who'd faced death before and wasn't particularly afraid of it, gave Harold pause. "This isn't over," Harold said finally. "Never thought it was," Caleb replied. Harold wheeled his horse and led his men back toward the road, but not toward his own house, toward Copper Creek, toward Ruth's boarding house. Caleb watched them go, then immediately saddled his own horse. Ruth needed warning. He rode hard, taking the shortcut through the hills that shaved 2 miles off the journey. The snow was falling heavier now, covering his tracks as he pushed the horse faster than was probably wise on uncertain ground. By the time he reached Copper Creek's main street, Harold and his men were already there, dismounting in front of the boarding house. Caleb tied his horse quickly and approached on foot, staying to the side of the building where he could see without being immediately seen. What he witnessed made him simultaneously furious and proud. Harold had stormed into Ruth's parlor demanding Eliza, but he'd found the room full of witnesses, not just Ruth, but Reverend Hammond, Miss Preston, Dr. Hayes, and at least 6 other women from town who just happened to be visiting at that exact moment. "I've come for my stepdaughter," Harold announced, his voice still carrying that wounded dignity. "Miss Monroe is resting," Ruth said calmly. "She's been quite ill." "Then I'll see her," Harold said. "I don't think that's wise. The doctor advised—" "I don't care what the doctor advised." Harold's control was slipping. "She's my responsibility, and I'm taking her home." "Against her will?" This from Reverend Hammond, his voice mild but his eyes sharp. Harold turned on him. "She's not in her right mind, Reverend. Surely you understand that sometimes we must act for the good of those who cannot see reason themselves." "I understand that imprisoning a young woman in a cellar is neither good nor reasonable," the Reverend replied quietly. The room went silent. Harold's face went white, then red. "That's a lie," he said flatly. "A vicious, slanderous lie told by an unstable girl who doesn't know what she's saying." "Is it?" Dr. Hayes spoke up, his old voice surprisingly strong. "Because I've examined Miss Monroe, Mr. Monroe. I've documented injuries consistent with prolonged confinement, rope burns, malnutrition, signs of deliberate neglect." "You old fool, you don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Hayes interrupted. "And I've written a full report for Judge Morrison, as is my legal and ethical duty." Harold looked around the room, seeing the trap for the first time. All these witnesses, all these respectable citizens, all of them looking at him with varying degrees of suspicion and disgust. "Fine," he said, forcing calm into his voice. "If Eliza wishes to stay here while she recovers, I won't force the issue, but she will marry Mr. Blackwood. I have legal authority, and I will exercise it." "We'll see what Judge Morrison says about that," Ruth said evenly. "Morrison won't be here for 3 weeks," Harold pointed out, "and the law is clear. I'm her guardian. My decision stands." "Then we'll wait 3 weeks," Ruth replied. "No," Harold said, "we won't. I'll be back tomorrow with Marshal Henderson and legal documents. And then, Mrs. Callahan, we'll see how brave you feel about harboring someone else's property." He stormed out, his hired men following, leaving a room full of stunned silence. Caleb waited until they'd ridden off before slipping inside through the back door. Ruth found him in the kitchen moments later. "You heard?" she asked. "Most of it," Caleb confirmed. "He's not bluffing about the marshal." "I know." Ruth looked tired suddenly, older. "Henderson will back whatever Harold says. We've bought time, but not much." "Where's Eliza?" Caleb asked. "Upstairs. Resting. Or trying to." Ruth met his eyes. "She's terrified, Mr. Turner. Putting on a brave face, but underneath she's waiting for the other shoe to drop." "Can we stop him legally? If he brings the marshal with a court order, then I have to comply," Ruth said. "Unless—" She trailed off, thinking. "Unless what?" "Unless she's not my responsibility anymore," Ruth said slowly. "If Eliza were married, Harold's guardianship would end immediately. Her husband would have legal authority, not her stepfather." Caleb understood where this was going. "You want me to marry her?" "I want you to save her life," Ruth corrected, "because that's what this is now. Harold's not going to let this go. He can't afford to. Too many people know, too many questions are being asked. He needs to silence Eliza, permanently, and marriage to Samuel gives him the legal cover to do exactly that." "How?" Caleb asked, though he suspected he already knew. Because once she's married, she becomes Samuel's responsibility, Ruth explained. And if Samuel's wife has an accident, if she falls downstairs like her mother did, who's going to question it? Tragic, everyone will say. Poor Samuel, just bad luck. The casual cruelty of it made Caleb's hands clench. We need to tell people. Who'll listen? Ruth interrupted. Harold's already planted the story that Eliza is mentally unstable. Anything she says will be dismissed as hysteria. Anything we say will be dismissed as gossip. The only thing that will save her is putting her legally beyond Harold's reach. By marrying a stranger, Caleb said. By marrying someone who won't kill her, Ruth replied bluntly. You don't have to love her, Mr. Turner. You don't even have to stay married. These things can be annulled. But right now, today, it's the only legal protection she has. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, thinking about his sister, about the wedding that never happened because she'd chosen death over marrying a monster, about all the promises he'd made to himself in the years since. I need to talk to her, he said finally. Upstairs, Ruth said. Third door on the left. He found Eliza standing by the window of a small but neat room, watching the snow fall on Copper Creek's main street. She turned when he entered, and he saw the truth of what Ruth had said. Beneath the brave exterior, she was bracing for disaster. You heard, she said. Not a question. Most of it, Caleb confirmed. Ruth has an idea. He explained it simply, without embellishment, watched her face as she absorbed what he was proposing. When he finished, Eliza was quiet for a long time. You'd marry me, she said finally, a woman you've known for 3 days, to protect me from a forced marriage to someone else. Yes, Caleb said. Why? It was the same question she'd asked in the cabin, but the context had shifted. Then, he'd been a stranger offering shelter. Now, he was a stranger offering something far more permanent. Because it's right, Caleb said simply. Because you deserve better than what Harold's offering. Because I promised myself I'd never stand by again while someone suffered if I could help. You told me about your sister, Eliza said quietly. Is that what this is? Redemption? Maybe, Caleb admitted. Does it matter? Eliza turned back to the window. A marriage of convenience, that's what they call it. We could annul it later, Caleb said. Once you're 25, once Harold's authority ends, you'd be free to leave, to live however you want. And in the meantime, Eliza asked, we'd have to make it convincing. Live together. Act as husband and wife. I'd respect your boundaries, Caleb said. I'm offering protection, not demanding anything in return. You'd be tied to me, Eliza said. Unable to marry anyone else. That's not nothing. It's something I'm willing to give, Caleb replied. Eliza was quiet again, and when she spoke, her voice was barely audible. I swore I'd never marry unless I loved someone. Never let anyone take that choice from me. I understand, Caleb said. And he did. After what Harold had tried to do, after weeks in that cellar, the idea of any marriage, even one meant to save her, must feel like a violation. But Harold's already taken most of my choices, Eliza continued, and if I don't choose this, he'll choose for me. At least with you. She turned to face him. At least with you. I know you won't hurt me. At least with you, I'd still be choosing. You don't have to decide now, Caleb said gently. Yes, I do, Eliza replied. Harold will be back tomorrow. If we're going to do this, we need to do it tonight. She was right. And standing there in that small room with snow falling outside and disaster approaching, Caleb saw the woman she really was beneath the trauma. Strong, practical, willing to do what survival required, even when it cost her dreams. All right, he said, if you're sure. I'm not sure of anything, Eliza admitted, but I'm certain I don't want to die. So yes, I'll marry you, Caleb Turner, and maybe someday we'll both forgive ourselves for what we had to do. Within the hour, Reverend Hammond had been consulted, and he'd agreed immediately to perform the ceremony. Miss Preston and Dr. Hayes would serve as witnesses. Ruth produced a simple dress that fit Eliza well enough, and someone found flowers despite the snow. It was the strangest wedding Caleb had ever seen. Hurried, desperate, born of necessity rather than love. But when he and Eliza stood before the Reverend in Ruth's parlor and spoke their vows, something shifted. This wasn't romance. It wasn't what either of them had imagined, but it was real. And when Reverend Hammond pronounced them husband and wife, when Caleb looked into Eliza's eyes and saw gratitude and fear and determination all mixed together, he knew they'd crossed a line they couldn't uncross. For better or worse, they were bound now. The next morning, when Harold Monroe arrived with Marshal Henderson and legal documents demanding Eliza's return, Ruth met them at the door with a smile. "I'm afraid that's impossible, gentlemen," she said pleasantly. "Mrs. Turner is no longer under her stepfather's authority. She's under her husband's protection now." Harold's face went purple. "Husband? What husband?" "Mine," Caleb said, stepping into view with Eliza beside him. "We were married last night, legal and binding, which means your guardianship is over, Monroe. She's my wife now." The look on Harold's face was worth every risk they'd taken. The silence that followed Caleb's declaration stretched like a wire pulled too tight, ready to snap. Harold Monroe stood in Ruth's doorway with the marshal beside him, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and something darker that Caleb recognized as pure hatred. Behind him, Samuel Blackwood had gone still, his cold eyes fixed on Eliza with an expression that made her unconsciously step closer to Caleb. "You're lying," Harold said finally, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "This is fraud. Collusion. I'll have it annulled before the ink dries." "The marriage was performed by Reverend Hammond last evening," Ruth said calmly. "Properly witnessed by Dr. Hayes and Miss Preston. All legal requirements were met. Would you like to see the certificate?" She produced the document from her apron pocket, holding it where Harold could read the signatures. Caleb watched the man's hands clench into fists as reality crashed down on whatever plans he'd made. "This changes nothing," Samuel growled, speaking for the first time. "The girl's mine. We had an arrangement." "You had an arrangement with her stepfather," Caleb corrected, keeping his voice level despite the anger building in his chest. "Eliza herself never agreed to anything, and now she's legally bound to someone else. Your arrangement's worth about as much as the paper it's not written on." Samuel took a step forward, his considerable bulk radiating menace. "You think you can just steal what belongs to me, cowboy? You have any idea who you're dealing with?" "A man who thinks people can be owned," Caleb replied. "Yeah, I got a pretty clear picture." Marshal Tom Henderson finally spoke up, his weathered face uncertain. "Now, hold on, everyone. Let's all stay calm here." He looked at Harold. "If there's a legal marriage, Harold, I'm not sure what you expect me to do about it." "I expect you to do your job," Harold snapped. "This marriage is fraudulent. Turner coerced my stepdaughter." "Actually, Mr. Turner proposed and I accepted," Eliza interrupted, her voice surprisingly steady. "Of my own free will, in front of multiple witnesses who can attest to my sound mind and willing consent." Harold turned on her with such venom that Caleb instinctively moved between them. "You ungrateful little, after everything I did for you, after I took you in when your mother died." "After you murdered my mother, you mean," Eliza said quietly. The words fell like stones into still water, their impact spreading in ripples through everyone present. The marshal's eyes widened. Ruth nodded grimly. Samuel looked genuinely surprised, which told Caleb the man probably hadn't known the full extent of Harold's sins. "That's slander," Harold said, but his voice had gone tight, controlled, dangerous. "My wife died in a tragic accident. The doctor ruled what you paid him to rule," Eliza continued, and Caleb could hear the years of suppressed rage finally finding voice. "But I saw the bruises, Harold. I saw where you grabbed her before she fell. I was 12 years old, and I saw everything. The ramblings of a disturbed child." "I was there," Dr. Hayes said from inside the parlor. All eyes turned to him. The old doctor stepped forward, his face grave. "Margaret Monroe came to me 3 days before she died, showed me bruises on her arms, her ribs, asked me to document them quietly. I did. Told myself I was protecting her privacy, that it was a family matter." His voice cracked slightly. "I've regretted my cowardice every day since." "You old fool," Harold hissed. "You have no proof of anything." "I have my medical notes," Hayes replied, "dated and detailed, and I have my testimony, which I'll gladly give to Judge Morrison when he arrives." Harold's composure was fracturing visibly now. Caleb could see him recalculating, trying to find a new angle of attack. When he spoke again, his voice had shifted back to wounded dignity, playing to the marshal. "This is character assassination, Tom. You know me. You know the kind of man I am. These people are trying to destroy my reputation with lies and innuendo because they want to steal my property, my business connections. That's what this is really about." "Your property?" Eliza's laugh was bitter. "You mean my mother's property, the land she inherited from her father, the money that was left in trust for me. Where is it, Harold? Where's the inheritance that was supposed to be mine when I turned 25? Invested, for your own good. Stolen," Eliza corrected. "Spent on your business ventures and your mistresses and your fine suits. I've seen the ledgers, Harold. I know what you did." This was news to Caleb, though he kept his face neutral. Eliza hadn't mentioned embezzlement, but it made sense. Men like Harold didn't stop at one crime when more were profitable. "Those are private family financial matters," Harold said, but sweat had appeared on his brow despite the cold morning air. "And regardless of wild accusations, the fact remains that this marriage was contracted in bad faith. Turner obviously coerced—" "Nobody coerced me," Eliza said firmly. "I married Caleb because I wanted to, because he's a good man who offered me protection when I needed it, because I'd rather be his wife than your prisoner or Samuel's victim." "You don't know what you want," Harold shot back. "You're 22 years old, you've been through trauma, you're not thinking clearly." "I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years," Eliza interrupted. "For the first time since my mother died, I'm making my own choices. And I choose Caleb. I choose freedom. I choose anything and anyone over you." The hatred in Harold's eyes was naked now. All pretense of concerned guardian burned away. "You'll regret this," he said softly. "Both of you. You think you've won, but you have no idea what you've started." "Is that a threat, Monroe?" Caleb asked quietly. "It's a promise." Harold turned to the marshal. "Are you going to do something about this, or do I need to wire the territorial governor about your incompetence?" Marshal Henderson looked deeply uncomfortable, caught between his patron's demands and the growing evidence that said patron was exactly the monster people were claiming. If there's a legal marriage, Harold, I can't just—" "Fine," Harold spat. "Then I'll handle this myself." He jabbed a finger at Caleb. "You want her? You can have her, along with every problem she brings. And when you're broken and bankrupt from trying to protect her, when you realize what a mistake you've made, don't come crying to me for mercy." He stormed off the porch, Samuel following, but the businessman stopped and turned back at the steps. "That land of yours, Turner," Samuel said conversationally. "The Hendricks place. You know why it was for sale so cheap? Because Tom Hendricks couldn't make the water payments. Creek rights come with a price in this valley, and when he couldn't pay, the bank foreclosed. Took everything he had." His smile was ugly. "That debt transfers with the land. You're already 3 months behind, Cowboy. And I happen to own the note." Caleb felt ice form in his stomach. "The land agent never mentioned." "Funny how that happens," Samuel continued. "You've got 30 days to bring that debt current, $500 plus interest. Think you can manage that on a cowhand's wages?" $500. Caleb had maybe $20 to his name and no way to earn that kind of money in 30 days, especially not with winter coming on. "Didn't think so," Samuel said, reading Caleb's expression. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to lose that ranch. You're going to lose everything, and your new bride is going to learn exactly what marrying a penniless failure costs." He glanced at Eliza with cold satisfaction. "Could have been a rich man's wife. Instead, you'll be begging in the streets by Christmas. Hope your pride keeps you warm." They left then, Harold and Samuel and their hired men riding back down Copper Creek's main street while curious townspeople watched from windows and doorways. The marshal lingered on the porch, looking miserable. "I'm sorry, folks," he said quietly. I'm not sure what the right thing to do here is." "Then do nothing," Ruth suggested. "Let Judge Morrison sort it out when he arrives." Henderson nodded gratefully and left, clearly relieved to escape the situation without having to choose sides definitively. Inside the parlor, Caleb stood with Eliza while Ruth, Dr. Hayes, Reverend Hammond, and Miss Preston gathered around them. The triumph of their successful marriage had evaporated, replaced by the cold reality of consequences. $500, Caleb said quietly.
I don't have it, can't get it. Then we'll raise it, Ruth said firmly. The town doesn't have that kind of money, Dr. Hayes interrupted gently. These are farmers and shopkeepers, Ruth. Good people, but not wealthy ones. And those who do have money are connected to Harold or Samuel's businesses. They won't help. There has to be something we can do, Miss Preston insisted. We can't let them win through legal manipulation. The law favors property and contracts, Reverend Hammond said sadly. If Samuel holds that debt, he can foreclose. It's ruthless, but it's legal. Caleb felt Eliza's hand slip into his, and when he looked down, he saw guilt written across her face. This is my fault, she said. If you hadn't helped me, you wouldn't be— Don't, Caleb interrupted firmly. I made my choice with eyes open.
No regrets. But you're going to lose everything. I've lost everything before, Caleb said. I survived. We'll survive this too. How? Eliza asked, and he heard the desperation in her voice. Where will we go? What will we do? It was a fair question. Without the ranch, Caleb had no income, no home, no prospects. Winter was coming, jobs were scarce, and being married to Eliza, Harold Monroe's enemy, would make finding work in this valley nearly impossible. Harold would make sure of that. Maybe we could leave, Eliza suggested. Go east, start over where Harold can't reach us. Running won't solve anything, Ruth said. Harold has reach beyond Colorado. Money buys connections. He could make your lives difficult anywhere you went. Then what do you suggest? Caleb asked. Ruth was quiet for a moment, thinking, then her eyes sharpened with an idea. What if you didn't lose the ranch? What if we found a way to pay the debt? With what money? Dr. Hayes asked skeptically. With Harold's money, Ruth said. Eliza, you said he embezzled your inheritance. How much are we talking about? I don't know exactly, Eliza replied. The trust my grandfather established was for $5,000. It was supposed to be untouchable until I turned 25, but Harold was named trustee after my mother died. $5,000. More than enough to pay Samuel's debt and have plenty left over, but that money's long gone, Caleb said. Spent or hidden or invested in Harold's businesses. We can't just demand it back. No, Ruth agreed. But we can make it a legal issue. If Eliza files a formal complaint about the embezzlement, if she demands an accounting of the trust funds, Harold would have to produce records. And if he can't prove the money was properly managed, he'd be facing criminal charges, Dr. Hayes finished, understanding dawning. Theft from a minor's trust fund. That's serious. That's leverage, Ruth corrected. We tell Harold we'll drop the embezzlement complaint if he pays off Caleb's debt and leaves you both alone. Clean slate. Everyone walks away. It was clever, but Caleb saw the problem immediately. Harold won't negotiate. You saw how he was. He'd rather see us destroyed than give an inch. Then we don't give him a choice, Miss Preston said, her Boston accent sharpening with determination. We make this public. I have contacts at newspapers back east, papers that would love a story about a wealthy Colorado businessman who murdered his wife, imprisoned his stepdaughter, and embezzled her inheritance. By the time I'm done, Harold Monroe's name will be synonymous with corruption from here to New York. That would destroy his business, Reverend Hammond said quietly. His reputation, everything he's built. Good, Eliza said fiercely. Let it all burn. He deserves worse than that. Caleb understood her anger. God knows he felt it too. But he also understood men like Harold. Cornered, desperate men were dangerous. Giving Harold nothing to lose was how people ended up dead. We need to be smart about this, he said carefully. If we come at Harold too hard, too publicly, he'll lash out. Could be violence, could be legal retaliation against everyone who's helped us. Ruth, you could lose your boarding house. Doctor, you could lose your practice. We need leverage, but we also need to give Harold an exit that doesn't leave him desperate. What are you suggesting? Ruth asked. We offer him a deal, Caleb said, the plan forming as he spoke. We have evidence of the embezzlement, the murder, the imprisonment. We could destroy him, but instead we offer to stay quiet in exchange for 3 things. First, he pays off the ranch debt. Second, he transfers Eliza's trust fund, what's left of it, into our names. Third, he leaves us alone permanently. No revenge, no retaliation, no future interference. He'll never agree, Eliza said. He will if the alternative is prison and ruin, Caleb replied. Men like Harold value their freedom and reputation above everything. Given a choice between losing some money or losing everything, he'll take the deal. And if he doesn't? Dr. Hayes asked. Then we burn him to the ground, Caleb said simply. But we give him the choice first. We give him a way out that doesn't back him into a corner. They debated the details for the next hour, refining the approach, deciding who would deliver the ultimatum and how. Finally, they agreed that Caleb and Reverend Hammond would ride to Harold's ranch that afternoon with their proposal. The Reverend's presence would lend moral authority and serve as a witness, while Caleb would make clear that violence wouldn't be tolerated. Before they left, Ruth pulled Caleb aside in the hallway. You're taking a big risk, she said quietly. Harold could just shoot you both and claim self-defense. I don't think he will, Caleb replied. He's too calculated for that, too worried about appearances. But if I'm wrong, he shrugged, at least Eliza will be safe. You'll look after her? Like she was my own daughter, Ruth promised. But try not to get killed. She's been through enough without becoming a widow in her first week of marriage. Caleb found Eliza in the small room upstairs, staring out the window at the snow-covered street. She turned when he entered, and he saw fear warring with hope in her expression. You're really going to face him, she said. I'm going to try to end this, Caleb corrected, one way or another. Eliza crossed to him, stopping close enough that he could see the gold flecks in her brown eyes. Caleb, if something happens to you, it won't, he interrupted gently. But if it does, she persisted, I need you to know I'm grateful for everything, for saving me, for believing me, for standing up to Harold when no one else would. You didn't have to do any of this. Yes, I did, Caleb said. Couldn't have lived with myself otherwise. Eliza reached up and touched his face, her fingers light against his jaw. It was the first time she'd touched him voluntarily since the wedding, and Caleb held very still, not wanting to spook her. You're a good man, she said softly. I didn't think men like you existed anymore. I'm just stubborn, Caleb replied, trying to lighten the moment. Too stupid to know when I'm beat. No, Eliza said seriously. You're brave and kind, and I'm very glad you bought that ranch next to Harold's. She smiled slightly, even if it's about to bankrupt us both. Before Caleb could respond, she stretched up and kissed his cheek. Quick, chaste, but deliberate. Then she stepped back, color rising in her pale face. For luck, she explained. Come back safe. Yes, ma'am, Caleb said, his own face warming. He left before the moment could become more complicated, finding Reverend Hammond waiting with the horses. They rode out of Copper Creek in silence, each man lost in his own thoughts. The ride to Harold's ranch took 30 minutes through increasingly heavy snow. By the time they arrived, the world had turned white and silent, the only sounds their horses breathing and the creak of saddle leather. Harold's house looked like something from a painting, pristine white clapboard against white snow, smoke rising from twin chimneys, everything orderly and prosperous. A lie, Caleb thought, a beautiful lie hiding rot beneath. They were met at the door by one of Harold's hired men, who showed them into the parlor without comment. Harold was there, along with Samuel Blackwood, both men warming themselves by a massive fireplace. They looked up when Caleb and the Reverend entered, Harold's face settling into cold disdain. Come to beg already? Harold asked. That was faster than I expected. We've come to negotiate, Reverend Hammond said calmly, to offer a resolution that serves everyone's interests. I'm not interested in resolutions, Harold replied. I'm interested in justice. Turner stole my stepdaughter. You imprisoned her, Caleb interrupted. Starved her. Left her to die. Don't talk to me about justice. Harold's eyes narrowed. You have no proof of that. We have Dr. Hayes's medical report, the Reverend said. We have Eliza's testimony. We have witnesses who saw her condition when she was freed. And we have the testimony of the hired man who initially locked her in that cellar on your orders. This was a bluff. They had no such testimony. But Harold's face flickered with something that might have been uncertainty. What do you want? Samuel asked, getting to the point. 3 things, Caleb said. First, you forgive the debt on my ranch. Clear the title, no strings attached. Second, Harold transfers what remains of Eliza's trust fund into our names, along with full documentation of where the original $5,000 went. Third, Both of you leave us alone. Permanently. No revenge, no retaliation, no attempts to interfere in our lives. And in exchange? Harold asked. We stay quiet, Caleb said. The embezzlement, the murder, the imprisonment, all of it stays private. We don't go to the newspapers. We don't press charges. We don't testify against you when Judge Morrison arrives. You get to keep your reputation, your business, your freedom. We get to live our lives in peace. The room was silent except for the fire crackling in the hearth. Harold and Samuel exchanged a long look, some unspoken communication passing between them. You're bluffing, Harold said finally. You don't have enough evidence to convict me of anything. Eliza's word against mine, some questionable medical notes, rumors, and gossip. No prosecutor would touch it. Maybe not in Colorado, Reverend Hammond said quietly, but Miss Preston has already sent letters to newspapers in Boston and New York. Papers that specialize in exposing Western corruption. They're quite interested in the story of a wealthy businessman who murdered his wife for her inheritance and tried to sell his stepdaughter to his business partner. Whether you're convicted or not, Mr. Monroe, your reputation will be destroyed. You sanctimonious bastard, Harold hissed at the Reverend. You'd use your position to spread lies? I'd use my position to tell the truth, Hammond corrected. Something you might try sometime. Samuel stood up, his bulk menacing in the firelight. This is extortion. No, Caleb said. Extortion is when you threaten someone to get something you're not entitled to. We're entitled to Eliza's inheritance. We're entitled to live without threats. We're offering you a chance to do the right thing and walk away clean. That's called mercy, not extortion. $500 for the debt, Samuel said, calculating. Another 1,000 or so for whatever's left of the trust. You expect me to just hand over $1,500? I expect you to pay what's owed, Caleb replied. The alternative costs you a lot more. Harold was staring into the fire, his jaw clenched so tight Caleb could see muscles jumping. When he spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. You think you've won. You think you've beaten me. But you're just a cowboy with delusions of heroism, married to a girl who'll hate you within a year for ruining her life. You'll be miserable together, struggling on that pathetic ranch, watching real men build real empires while you scrape by. Maybe, Caleb allowed, but I'll be free, and so will Eliza. That's worth more than all your money and power combined. Freedom, Harold laughed bitterly. You're a fool, Turner, but fine. You want your deal? You've got it. Samuel will clear the debt. I'll transfer $1,500 to cover what's left of Eliza's trust. That's more than generous, given how much I spent raising the ungrateful girl. And then you and my dear stepdaughter can ride off into the sunset and freeze to death in that cabin for all I care. We'll need it in writing, Reverend Hammond said. Legal documents, properly witnessed. You'll have them by tomorrow, Harold said. Now get out of my house before I forget I'm a civilized man and shoot you both for trespassing. They left without another word, riding back through the snow toward Copper Creek. Caleb's heart was pounding, adrenaline from the confrontation still singing through his veins. They'd done it. They'd actually done it. But as they rode, Reverend Hammond spoke quietly. He agreed too easily. What? Caleb turned in his saddle. Harold, the Reverend explained. He folded too quickly. A man like that who's fought his whole life to build power, who murders for control. He doesn't just surrender because of threats. He's planning something. Caleb felt cold that had nothing to do with the snow. What could he do? We'll have legal documents, witnesses. Legal documents can be contested. Witnesses can be intimidated or bought. Hammond's face was troubled. I'm not saying don't trust the agreement. I'm saying don't trust Harold to honor it beyond the letter of what's required. Watch your back, Mr. Turner. And watch Eliza's. Because men like Harold Monroe don't forget slights, and they don't forgive defeat. They rode the rest of the way in silence, each man wrapped in thoughts darker than the storm clouds gathering overhead. At Ruth's boarding house, Eliza met them at the door, her face anxious until she saw they were both unhurt. Caleb explained the agreement, watched relief and disbelief chase across her features. He agreed? She asked. Just like that? Just like that, Caleb confirmed, not mentioning the Reverend's concerns. Time enough for caution later. For now, let her have this moment of victory. But that night, lying in the small room Ruth had given them, Caleb on the floor despite Eliza's protests that he take the bed, He couldn't sleep. The Reverend's words echoed in his mind, mixing with memories of Harold's eyes across the parlor. That hadn't been the look of a defeated man. That had been the look of someone biding his time. 3 days later, true to his word, Harold's lawyer arrived with legal documents transferring the ranch title free and clear to Caleb Turner, along with a bank draft for $1,500 made out to Caleb and Eliza jointly. Samuel Blackwood sent a letter confirming the debt had been forgiven, all claims satisfied. On paper, they'd won completely. The town buzzed with gossip about it all: the dramatic rescue, the hasty marriage, the confrontation with Harold Monroe. Opinion was divided. Some saw Caleb as a hero and Eliza as a brave survivor. Others whispered that she'd been fast with the new neighbor, that the whole thing smelled of scandal and impropriety. Ruth and Reverend Hammond worked tirelessly to shape the narrative toward truth, but rumors had their own momentum. Caleb and Eliza moved back to the ranch a week after the settlement, once she was strong enough for the journey. Ruth had fed her well, Dr. Hayes had tended her injuries, and color had returned to her face. She still tired easily, and her cough lingered, but she was alive and healing. The cabin felt different with 2 people in it. Smaller somehow, but also warmer. More lived in. They established routines carefully, dancing around each other like strangers thrust into intimacy neither had chosen. Caleb gave Eliza the bed and took the floor despite her arguments. He worked during the day repairing the barn and fences, preparing for winter. She cooked what provisions they bought in town, mended his clothes, tried to make the rough cabin into something approaching a home. They were polite, careful. 2 people bound by law and circumstance trying to figure out how to be married when neither had planned on it. At night, lying in the darkness with the fire dying to embers, they sometimes talked. Small things at first: favorite foods, childhood memories, dreams they'd had before life got complicated. Slowly, tentatively, they began to know each other. "Why did you really come to Colorado?" Eliza asked one night. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. "I told you about my sister." "Yes, but there's more, isn't there?" There was. There always was with people running from their pasts. Caleb found himself telling her about the years after he'd left Missouri. The wandering, the drinking, the fights, how he'd ended up in Cheyenne working as a cowhand for a man who treated his workers barely better than his cattle. How Caleb had finally stood up to him, and how that had led to 3 months in jail on trumped-up charges of theft. "Were you guilty?" Eliza asked quietly. "No," Caleb said. "But I was convenient and poor and powerless, so I was guilty enough for a judge who owed the rancher favors." He stared at the ceiling. "Got out, decided I was done working for other people. Saved every penny for 2 years. When I saw that land advertisement, saw a chance to own something, to build something that was mine, I took it. Didn't matter that it was in the middle of nowhere. Didn't matter that I had no idea what I was doing. It was mine." "And now it's ours," Eliza said. "Yeah," Caleb agreed. "Ours." Another night, Eliza told him about her mother. The real story, not the sanitized version she'd grown up with. How her mother Margaret had been a Boston debutante who'd fallen in love with an Irish immigrant laborer. How her family had disowned her for marrying beneath her station. How they'd struggled in poverty but been happy until Eliza's father died in the mines. "She married Harold 2 years later," Eliza said. "I think she was just tired of struggling, tired of being poor and alone with a child to raise. Harold seemed respectable, stable. She thought he'd provide security." Her voice hardened. "He provided a cage." "I'm sorry," Caleb said. "Don't be sorry," Eliza replied. "Just don't ever become like him. Promise me that." "I promise," Caleb said, and meant it with everything he had. The weeks passed. November came, bringing serious snow and temperatures that regularly dropped below zero. The ranch work was relentless, feeding the few cattle Caleb had managed to buy with part of the settlement money, keeping the pipes from freezing, maintaining the fire, hunting for meat when provisions ran low. But they made it work. Eliza proved stronger than she looked, insisting on carrying her weight despite Caleb's protests. She learned to shoot his rifle well enough to bring down rabbits, and once, memorably, a young deer that kept them in meat for 2 weeks. Caleb taught her to read weather signs, to track animals, to survive in the wilderness that surrounded them. In return, she taught him things he hadn't realized he needed. How to make a cabin feel like a home with small touches, wildflowers in summer, carefully arranged stones by the fireplace, curtains sewn from old fabric. How to laugh again, something he'd almost forgotten how to do. How to talk about feelings and fears instead of burying them under stoic silence. Slowly, almost without noticing, the careful distance between them began to close. It wasn't romance exactly, or maybe it was, but of a kind neither had expected, built not on passion or grand gestures, but on shared hardship and mutual respect, on discovering that the person you'd married out of desperation was actually someone you could admire, someone you could trust, someone you might even love, given time. But Harold Monroe hadn't forgotten them. The first sign came in mid-November when Caleb rode to town for supplies and found the general store refusing his business. "Sorry, Turner," the shopkeeper said, not meeting his eyes. "Can't sell to you no more?" "Why not?" Caleb demanded. "Just can't, that's all." He tried the feed and tack. Same response. The restaurant wouldn't serve him. Even the saloon, normally happy to take anyone's money, turned him away. Caleb found Ruth at her boarding house, and she explained with quiet fury what had happened. "Harold's called in favors," she said. "Quietly reminded people who owns what in this town, who holds which debts, who could make life difficult. Anyone who does business with you or Eliza gets cut off from Harold's suppliers, his freight contracts, his goodwill. He's blackballing you." "That son of a—" Caleb bit off the curse. "We had an agreement." "The agreement said he wouldn't retaliate directly," Ruth pointed out. "This is indirect. He's not threatening you or hurting you personally. He's just making life difficult, and he's doing it in ways that are hard to prove or fight." It was brilliant in a cruel way. Harold couldn't attack them openly without breaking the agreement and risking exposure. But he could make sure they were isolated, cut off from the community, unable to easily get the supplies they needed to survive the winter. Caleb rode back to the ranch and told Eliza what had happened. She listened with a face that grew progressively harder. "We could go to Denver," she suggested, "buy supplies there." "Denver's a 3-day ride in good weather," Caleb said. "In winter, it's more like a week. We'd spend more on the trip than we'd save avoiding Harold's influence." "Then what do we do?" Caleb thought about it. "We get creative, hunt more, buy less, trade with ranchers outside Harold's sphere of influence. Make do and survive until spring, when we can plant and raise our own food." It would be hard, harder than anything they'd faced yet, but they'd survived cellars and confrontations and forced marriages. They could survive a Colorado winter, Harold Monroe's petty revenge be damned. And in the darkness of his heart, Caleb began to understand something the Reverend had tried to warn him about. Men like Harold didn't need to destroy you openly. They just needed to make sure you destroyed yourself through isolation and hardship. The real fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Winter tightened its grip on the valley like a fist closing around stone. By late November, the temperature rarely climbed above freezing, and the snow had accumulated in drifts that reached halfway up the cabin walls on the north side. Caleb and Eliza woke each morning to frost coating the inside of the window, their breath visible in the air until the fire could be coaxed back to life from the previous night's embers. The isolation Harold had engineered proved more effective than any direct attack could have been. They managed one trip to Denver before the passes became impassable, returning with enough flour, salt, and coffee to last through winter if they were careful. But other necessities, nails, tools, medicine, fabric, would have to wait until spring or be done without entirely. Caleb threw himself into making the ranch self-sufficient. He hunted almost daily, bringing back deer, elk, rabbits, and once a small bear whose hide became a blanket that helped keep Eliza warm through the coldest nights. He cut firewood until his hands bled, stacking cords against the cabin wall in defiance of the endless cold. He repaired equipment with whatever materials he could scavenge or improvise, learning to make do with wire and hope instead of proper parts. Eliza matched his determination with her own stubborn resilience. She learned to tan hides, producing leather they could use for boots and repairs. She foraged in the forest during brief warm spells, finding herbs and roots she remembered from her mother's teachings. She became expert at stretching provisions, making a pound of flour last twice as long through clever substitutions and careful rationing.
But the work took its toll on both of them. Caleb lost weight he couldn't afford to lose, his face becoming gaunt and hard.
Eliza's cough returned, worse than before, leaving her exhausted after even simple tasks. Some nights, Caleb would wake to hear her trying to muffle the sound so she wouldn't wake him, and his heart would clench with worry he didn't know how to voice. They didn't talk about the strain, didn't acknowledge the fear that crept in during the darkest hours, the fear that Harold might win after all, not through violence or legal manipulation, but through simple attrition, that they might simply not survive the winter. Instead, they talked about spring. "I'll plant a garden," Eliza said one evening, mending Caleb's shirt by firelight while he cleaned his rifle. "Vegetables, herbs, maybe some flowers near the door. My mother always said a home needed flowers." "I'll expand the barn," Caleb replied, playing along with the fantasy of survival. "Get more cattle, maybe some chickens, build proper fences." "We could host a harvest dinner," Eliza continued, warming to the dream. "Invite Ruth and Dr. Hayes, the Reverend. Show everyone we made it." "We will make it," Caleb said, and tried to believe it. The second week of December brought a storm that buried the valley under 3 feet of snow in 2 days. They were trapped inside the cabin, the world beyond their door transformed into a white void where the boundary between earth and sky disappeared. Caleb used the forced stillness to tackle indoor repairs, fixing the door that had been sticking, reinforcing the bed frame, building shelves to better organize their dwindling supplies. Eliza used the time to teach herself to read from the one book Caleb owned, a battered copy of Pilgrim's Progress he'd bought years ago and never finished. She'd had some education before her mother died, but Harold had considered schooling for girls a waste. Now she attacked the printed words with fierce concentration, determined to reclaim what had been denied her. "Listen to this," she said one afternoon, reading aloud. "Though with great difficulty I am got hither, yet now I do not repent me of all the trouble I have been at to arrive where I am. My sword I give to him that shall succeed me in my pilgrimage, and my courage and skill to him that can get it." She looked up at Caleb, her eyes bright. "That's us, isn't it? We got here with great difficulty, but we're here, and we won't repent of the trouble." "No," Caleb agreed softly. "We won't." It was in those long, snowbound days that something shifted between them. The careful distance they'd maintained, sleeping separately, avoiding touch, treating their marriage as the legal arrangement it had begun as, started to feel less necessary, less wanted. It began with small things. Eliza's hand on Caleb's shoulder as she passed behind him, Caleb steadying Eliza when her cough left her dizzy, his arm around her waist lingering a moment longer than strictly required. Conversations that stretched late into the night, covering everything from philosophy to favorite childhood memories, creating an intimacy that had nothing to do with physical proximity and everything to do with truly seeing each other. One night, as they lay in their separate sleeping arrangements, Caleb on the floor wrapped in blankets, Eliza in the bed, she spoke into the darkness. "Caleb? Yeah? This is a stupid arrangement. You on the floor, me in the bed, we're married and it's freezing, and we're both too stubborn to admit we'd be warmer sharing." Caleb's heart hammered against his ribs. "Eliza, I don't want you to feel—" "I know you don't," she interrupted. "I know you'd sleep on ice before you'd make me uncomfortable. But I'm telling you I'm not uncomfortable. I'm cold, and you're cold, and there's a perfectly good solution if we're both brave enough to take it." "Are you sure?" Caleb asked quietly. "I'm sure I trust you," Eliza replied. "I'm sure I know you're not Harold or Samuel or any man who'd take advantage. I'm sure that we're partners in this, whatever this is becoming. So yes, I'm sure." Caleb rose from his pile of blankets and crossed to the bed, his movements careful, giving Eliza every chance to change her mind. But she didn't. She shifted over, making room, and when he lay down beside her, still fully clothed, still maintaining every propriety, she curled against his side with a sigh of relief. "Better," she murmured. "Much better." "Yeah," Caleb agreed, his arm coming around her shoulders tentatively. "Better." They slept that way, sharing warmth and comfort without expectation or demand, and in the morning when they woke, neither mentioned it. But the next night, Eliza didn't suggest he take the floor, and the night after that, when she curled against him, Caleb's arm went around her without hesitation. The storm broke on the 4th day, revealing a world transformed. The valley sparkled under brilliant sun, snow so white it hurt to look at, the sky an impossible blue. Caleb dug them out of the cabin, then snowshoed his way to the creek to check the cattle. He found one young steer dead, frozen during the storm, and felt the loss like a blow. They couldn't afford to lose livestock. Every animal represented food, security, survival. But the remaining cattle were alive, sheltered in the lean-to Caleb had built against the barn. He broke ice on the creek so they could drink, scattered hay he'd cut in the autumn, and said a prayer he wasn't sure anyone was listening to that they'd make it through. On his way back to the cabin, he noticed tracks in the snow. Not deer or elk, too large for that. He knelt, examining them with a tracker's eye, and felt ice form in his gut that had nothing to do with the weather. Horse tracks. Multiple horses, shod and heavy, leading from the road toward their property, circling the perimeter, then heading back. Someone had scouted their ranch during the storm, taking advantage of the weather to observe without being seen. Harold's men, Caleb was certain. But why? What was there to scout? They had nothing worth stealing, no vulnerability that wasn't already obvious, unless Harold was planning something more than economic isolation. Caleb followed the tracks as far as he could, but they disappeared into wind-blown drifts near the road. He returned to the cabin and found Eliza kneading bread dough with fierce concentration, her face flushed from the heat of the stove they'd managed to install with part of the settlement money. "We had visitors during the storm," Caleb said without preamble. Eliza's hand stilled. "Harold?" "His men, I think. They didn't approach the cabin, just circled the property and left, like they were looking for something." "Looking for what?" "I don't know," Caleb admitted, "but I don't like it." Harold agreed to leave us alone, but those tracks say he's still watching, still planning. Eliza resumed kneading, her movements now tight with tension. "Maybe we should go to the marshal, show him the tracks, demand protection." "Henderson won't do anything without proof of actual harm," Caleb said. "And tracks in the snow aren't proof of anything illegal. Harold could say his men were out riding, got lost in the storm, ended up on our land by accident." "Then what do we do?" "We stay alert," Caleb said. "We keep the rifle loaded, we don't both leave the cabin at the same time, and we watch for anything unusual." But unusual came from an unexpected direction. 2 days later, they had a visitor. Caleb saw him coming from a mile away, a lone rider on a dark horse, picking his way carefully through the snow-covered valley. His hand went to his rifle automatically, but as the rider drew closer, Caleb recognized him. Marshal Tom Henderson. The lawman looked miserable, bundled in a heavy coat that still didn't seem adequate for the cold. He dismounted stiffly, obviously not accustomed to long winter rides, and approached the cabin with the expression of a man delivering bad news. "Turner," he said by way of greeting. "Mrs. Turner, sorry to bother you folks." "What can we do for you, Marshal?" Caleb asked, not inviting him inside. Henderson shifted uncomfortably. "There's been complaints from Harold Monroe. Says you've been trespassing on his property, damaging his fences, harassing his livestock." "That's a lie," Caleb said flatly. "I haven't been on Monroe's land since the night I found Eliza." "I figured as much," Henderson admitted. "But I had to ride out, make a show of investigating. Harold's making noise in town, getting people worked up. Says you're a danger to the community, that you kidnapped his stepdaughter, and now you're trying to ruin him out of spite." "The truth doesn't matter to him, does it?" Eliza asked, her voice hard. "The truth matters to me," Henderson said, surprising them both. "Which is why I'm telling you that Harold's building a case. He's talking about getting you arrested, Turner. Maybe even getting your marriage annulled on grounds of coercion or fraud." "He can't do that," Eliza protested. "We have witnesses, legal documents." "He can try," Henderson interrupted. "And in the trying, he can make your lives hell. Legal battles cost money and time. Even if you win eventually, the process could break you." He looked at Caleb directly. "I'm not saying this as Harold's man. I'm saying it as someone who's seen what he does to people who cross him. You should consider leaving. Taking that settlement money and starting over somewhere. Harold's reach doesn't extend." "We're not leaving," Caleb said. "I was afraid you'd say that." Henderson sighed. "Then watch yourselves. Harold's got friends I don't know about, influence in places I can't track. If he decides to escalate beyond legal harassment, I might not be able to protect you." Why are you warning us? Eliza asked. You're Harold's man. Everyone knows it. Henderson was quiet for a moment, staring out at the snow-covered valley. When he spoke, his voice was tired. I took an oath to uphold the law, not to serve Harold Monroe. I've bent that oath more than I'm proud of over the years, looked the other way when I should have looked closer. But what he did to you, Mrs. Turner, that cellar business, he shook his head. That crossed a line even I can't ignore. So I'm giving you fair warning. Harold's coming for you one way or another. Be ready. He left without another word, riding back toward Copper Creek through the frozen landscape. Caleb and Eliza watched until he disappeared, then turned to each other. He's right, Eliza said. We should leave, take the money, go east, start over. Is that what you want? Caleb asked. Eliza was quiet for a long moment. No, she admitted finally. I don't want to run anymore. I don't want to let Harold win. But I also don't want you to die for my pride. It's not pride, Caleb said. It's principle. And it's ours, this land, this life we're building. If we let Harold drive us off, where does it end? How many times do we run before we're too tired to keep running? Then we stay, Eliza said, and we fight. We stay, Caleb agreed, and we fight. The attack came 3 weeks later, in the dead of night during a new moon when the darkness was absolute. Caleb woke to the smell of smoke and was on his feet with the rifle in his hands before conscious thought caught up. Beside him, Eliza sat up, her eyes wide with fear. The barn, Caleb said, seeing orange light flickering through the window. They're burning the barn. He ran outside without bothering to dress properly, the cold hitting him like a wall. The barn was fully engulfed, flames reaching toward the black sky, the terrified bellowing of cattle cutting through the roar of fire. Caleb sprinted through the snow, knowing it was probably already too late, but unable to stand by and watch. The heat was intense, pushing him back when he tried to get close. Inside, the cattle screamed. Caleb could see them through gaps in the burning walls, trapped, dying. He tried to reach the door, to open it and at least give them a chance to escape, but the flames drove him back again. A hand grabbed his arm. Eliza, her face streaked with tears from the smoke and the horror of it. You can't save them, she shouted over the fire's roar. Caleb, you'll die if you try. She was right. The barn was lost, and the cattle with it. Caleb backed away, helpless rage filling him as he watched their livestock burn. Everything they'd worked for, everything they'd sacrificed, gone in flames Harold Monroe had almost certainly ordered. By dawn, only charred timbers remained. The cattle were dead, reduced to burned carcasses in the ruins. The chickens Caleb had been planning to buy in spring wouldn't have a coop to live in. The hay they'd stored for winter feed was ash, and written in the snow outside the barn, traced by a boot or stick before the fire started, was a simple message: leave. Eliza stood beside Caleb in the gray morning light, staring at the destruction. She was shivering, from cold or shock or both, and Caleb put his arm around her, pulling her close. We report this to Henderson, Caleb said, his voice hoarse from smoke. This is arson, maybe murder if the cattle count. Even Harold can't talk his way out of this. But when Marshal Henderson arrived later that morning, his face told the story before his words did. I can investigate, he said, looking at the ruins. But unless you can prove who set the fire, there's nothing I can do. Could have been lightning, sparks from your stove, any number of accidents. In the middle of the night? Caleb demanded, with a message written in the snow? Message could have been kids playing pranks, Henderson said, but he wouldn't meet Caleb's eyes. Or you could have written it yourself for sympathy. I'm not saying that's what happened, but that's what a lawyer would argue in court. Harold did this, Eliza said flatly. Prove it, Henderson replied. Show me evidence that would hold up in front of Judge Morrison, and I'll arrest Harold Monroe myself. But suspicion isn't evidence, and I can't act on feelings. He left them there in the ashes of their dreams, and Caleb understood with crystal clarity that they were truly alone. The law wouldn't help them. The town wouldn't help them. Ruth and Dr. Hayes and Reverend Hammond would offer sympathy and shelter, but they couldn't stop Harold any more than the marshal could, or would. That night, lying in the darkness of the cabin with Eliza curled against him, Caleb spoke quietly. We could leave. Take what's left of the money, ride out tomorrow, Be in Denver in a week, on a train east within 2 weeks. Start over where Harold can't reach us." "Is that what you want?" Eliza asked, echoing his words from weeks ago. "I want you safe," Caleb said honestly. "I want you alive and healthy and free from fear. If leaving accomplishes that, then yes. That's what I want." Eliza was silent for so long Caleb thought she'd fallen asleep. Then she spoke, her voice steady with the decision he could hear had cost her. "My mother ran once, from her family, from Boston society, from everything she'd known. She thought marrying my father would give her freedom and happiness, and it did, for a while. Then he died, and she ran again, into Harold's arms this time, thinking he'd provide safety. And that running, that fear, that constant searching for security in other people instead of in herself, it killed her. Maybe not the fall down the stairs, but everything that led to that moment." She shifted, propping herself up to look at Caleb in the dim firelight. "I won't run anymore. I won't let Harold chase me from place to place until I'm too tired to fight anymore. This is our land, our home. We've bled for it, suffered for it, almost died for it. And I'll be damned if I let a monster like Harold Monroe take it from us." "It might cost us everything," Caleb warned. "Living in fear costs more," Eliza replied. "I learned that in the cellar. I'd rather die free than live as a prisoner, even if the prison is built from my own fear." Caleb pulled her close, pressing his face into her hair, and felt something break open in his chest. This woman, this fierce, stubborn, impossibly brave woman, had become more than his responsibility, more than his wife in name only. "I love you," he said, the words surprising him even as he spoke them. "I don't know when it happened, somewhere between the cellar and the cabin, between the fear and the fighting. But I do. I love you, Eliza." She went very still in his arms. Then she pulled back enough to see his face, her eyes searching his in the firelight. "You mean that?" she said wonderingly. "You actually mean it?" "Yes," Caleb confirmed. "I know it's too soon. I know we barely know each other. I know this started as—" She kissed him, cutting off his words with her mouth on his. It was their first real kiss. Not the chaste peck she'd given him for luck before he confronted Harold, but something deeper, more urgent, a claiming and a giving both, a declaration that needed no words. When they finally pulled apart, Eliza was crying. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been terrified to admit it because I thought you were just being noble, just doing your duty. But if you love me, if you actually love me, then we have something Harold can't take, something worth fighting for." They made love that night, slowly and gently, two people learning each other's bodies as they'd learned each other's hearts. And afterward, lying tangled together beneath the bear hide blanket, Caleb felt a peace he hadn't known since childhood. Whatever came next, fire or fury or Harold Monroe's worst, they'd face it together. The next morning, Caleb rode to Copper Creek and sent a telegram to Denver, to the newspapers Miss Preston had contacted, to lawyers who specialized in frontier justice, to anyone who might listen to their story. He wrote out everything. Harold's crimes, the arson, the harassment, the attempted murder in the cellar. He spent money they couldn't afford to spend, sent messages to people who might not care. But doing nothing wasn't an option anymore. When he returned to the ranch, he found Eliza clearing debris from the burned barn with a determination that made him love her even more. "We rebuild," she said simply when she saw his questioning look. "Harold burned it down. We build it back. That's how we fight. We refuse to be destroyed." So they rebuilt. Through the rest of that brutal winter, they worked. Caleb salvaged what he could from the ruins, cut new timber from the forest, traded labor with a rancher 2 valleys over who hadn't fallen under Harold's influence. Eliza helped despite the cold aggravating her cough, refusing to stay inside when there was work to be done. Word of the fire spread, and slowly, quietly, help began to arrive. Not from Copper Creek, Harold's influence kept the town locked down, but from outlying ranches, from settlers who remembered their own struggles, from people who'd heard rumors about Harold Monroe and decided they'd seen enough injustice. A family named Patterson brought lumber they'd cut but didn't need. Old man Schaefer, who ran cattle 40 miles north, sent his 2 sons to help with the heavy construction. Even Ruth made the dangerous winter journey with food and medicine, staying 3 days to nurse Eliza through a particularly bad spell with her cough. "You're not alone," Ruth told them before she left. "Harold wants you to think you are, wants you to feel isolated and defeated. But there are good people in this territory, Caleb, and good people recognize evil when they see it, eventually." By late February, they had a new barn. Not as large as the old one, and rougher in construction, but solid, functional, standing as a testament to their refusal to quit. In early March, Judge Morrison finally arrived in Copper Creek for his twice-yearly circuit. Caleb and Eliza rode into town together, Caleb's rifle across his saddle, both of them prepared for confrontation. They found Harold already at the courthouse, a single room in the back of the general store, with his lawyer and his ledgers ready to present his version of events. But they also found Dr. Hayes with his medical reports, Reverend Hammond with his testimony, Miss Preston with copies of letters she'd sent to Eastern newspapers, and to Caleb's surprise, Marshal Henderson, looking uncomfortable but determined. "I'll testify to what I know," Henderson told them quietly before the proceedings began. "It won't be everything you want, but it'll be the truth. I'm done protecting Harold Monroe." Judge Morrison was a hard-faced man in his 60s, weathered by years of frontier justice. He listened to both sides with equal attention, Harold's claims of trespassing and harassment, Caleb and Eliza's counterclaims of arson and attempted murder. He reviewed documents, examined evidence, asked pointed questions that left Harold's lawyer stammering. The proceedings lasted 2 days. On the morning of the third day, Judge Morrison delivered his ruling. "I find no evidence to support Mr. Monroe's claims against Mr. and Mrs. Turner," he announced. "Furthermore, I find the evidence of harassment against Mrs. Turner while she was under Mr. Monroe's guardianship to be disturbing and credible. While I cannot prove arson without witnesses to the actual crime, I am issuing a formal restraining order prohibiting Mr. Monroe from entering Turner property or having any contact with Mrs. Turner except through legal representatives." "Your Honor, this is outrageous," Harold's lawyer began. "I'm not finished," Morrison interrupted coldly. "I am also referring the matter of Mrs. Turner's missing inheritance to the territorial attorney for investigation. If evidence of embezzlement is found, criminal charges will be filed. This court is adjourned." It wasn't total victory. Harold wasn't going to jail, the burned barn wasn't being compensated, and the restraining order was only as strong as their ability to enforce it. But it was vindication, public legal vindication that Harold Monroe was in the wrong. As they left the courthouse, Caleb saw something in Harold's eyes that sent ice through his veins. Not defeat, not even anger, calculation. Harold Monroe wasn't done with them, he was just changing tactics. The calculation in Harold's eyes haunted Caleb during the ride back to the ranch. Eliza sat beside him on the wagon seat, exhausted but triumphant, talking about what Judge Morrison's ruling meant for their future. But Caleb kept seeing that look, kept remembering the Reverend's warning from months ago. Men like Harold Monroe didn't accept defeat. They adapted. Spring came to the valley in fits and starts, warm days followed by late snows that caught everyone by surprise. By mid-April, the worst of winter had broken, and the land began to show signs of life. Caleb spent long days breaking ground for the garden Eliza had dreamed about during the darkest months. She worked beside him when her strength allowed, her cough finally fading as the weather warmed, color returning to her face with each passing week. They'd survived. Against odds that should have broken them, they'd made it through winter, through Harold's harassment, through isolation and poverty and fear. The ranch was still standing, their marriage was real, and spring meant new beginnings. But Harold's silence worried Caleb more than his attacks ever had. 6 weeks after Judge Morrison's ruling, the territorial attorney arrived in Copper Creek to investigate the embezzlement claims. His name was Robert Kincaid, a sharp young lawyer from Denver, with a reputation for going after corrupt officials and businessmen. Harold met with him privately for 3 hours, emerging with his lawyer and an expression that sent warning bells ringing through town. Caleb heard about it from Ruth, who rode out to the ranch 2 days later with news and concerns. "Harold's turned over his financial records voluntarily," she explained, accepting the coffee Eliza poured. "All of them, ledgers, bank statements, investment documents, cooperating completely with the investigation." "That doesn't make sense," Eliza said. "Those records prove he stole my inheritance." "That's what I thought," Ruth agreed. "But according to what I'm hearing, Harold's records show he invested your trust fund in legitimate business ventures, mining stocks, freight contracts, land purchases. Most of them lost money, but he can show he acted in good faith as your trustee. Caleb felt his stomach sink. He doctored the books. Almost certainly, Ruth confirmed. Had months to do it after you first confronted him. Kincaid's good, but unless he can prove the records are fraudulent, Harold walks away clean. Might even look like the wronged party, a careful trustee whose investment simply didn't pan out. There has to be something, Eliza insisted. The money didn't just disappear. He spent it on himself, his businesses, his lifestyle. Proving that is different than knowing it, Ruth said gently. Harold's covered his tracks well, and now he's playing the victim, talking around town about how he's being persecuted for trying to protect his unstable stepdaughter from a fortune hunter. The narrative was shifting. Caleb could feel it happening, could imagine Harold working the town, spreading his version of events to anyone who'd listen. The concerned guardian versus the scheming cowboy who'd stolen his daughter. It was a story people wanted to believe because it was simpler than the truth, because it didn't require them to acknowledge that a respected businessman could be a monster. What does Kincaid think? Caleb asked. He's frustrated but professional, Ruth said. Says without concrete evidence of fraud, he can't bring charges. He's still investigating, but Harold's cooperation makes him look guilty of nothing more than bad investments. She paused. There's something else. Samuel Blackwood left Colorado last week, went back east, closed out his Denver operations. Word is he and Harold had a falling out over the failed marriage arrangement. This was potentially good news. Samuel had been Harold's ally and financial backer. If that relationship had fractured, Harold's resources were diminished. But Caleb's instincts said it meant something else entirely. Samuel was cutting ties, distancing himself from whatever Harold was planning. Smart men didn't abandon profitable partnerships without reason. Harold's planning something, Caleb said aloud. Something big enough that Samuel wants no part of it. I think so too, Ruth agreed, which is why I'm here. To warn you both to be careful, extra careful. Whatever Harold's next move is, it's going to be worse than burning a barn. She left before evening, making her way back to Copper Creek under a sky threatening rain. Caleb and Eliza stood on the porch, watching her go, then turned to face each other. What do we do? Eliza asked. We stay alert, Caleb said. We trust our instincts, and we prepare for the worst. The attack came from a direction neither of them anticipated. 2 weeks later, a stranger arrived at their door. He was well-dressed, middle-aged, with the bearing of someone used to authority. He introduced himself as Thomas Whitmore, a federal land agent from Denver, and asked to see their property deed. Caleb's warning bells started ringing immediately, but he retrieved the document and handed it over. Whitmore examined it carefully, then pulled out a surveyor's map and spread it across their kitchen table. Mr. Turner, Mrs. Turner, I'm afraid there's been a significant error in your land claim, Whitmore said with professional sympathy. The property you purchased was surveyed incorrectly. The eastern boundary is actually 300 yards west of where the previous owner believed it to be. Caleb felt the world tilt. What does that mean? It means your cabin, your barn, and approximately 60 acres of what you believe is your property actually belongs to your neighbor, Harold Monroe, Whitmore explained. The error dates back to the original land grant in 1873. We're only catching it now because Mr. Monroe requested a formal resurvey after disputes arose about property boundaries. That's impossible, Eliza said, her voice sharp. This is our land. We have the deed. We paid for it. You paid for what the previous owner believed he owned, Whitmore corrected gently. Unfortunately, his belief was based on a flawed survey. The Federal Land Office recognizes only the corrected boundaries, which means, technically, you're currently residing on Mr. Monroe's property. The implications crashed down on Caleb like an avalanche. If the cabin was on Harold's land, they were trespassers. Harold could evict them legally, force them off property they'd paid for, suffered for, nearly died for. Everything they'd built would belong to their enemy. I want to see this survey, Caleb demanded. I want it verified by an independent surveyor. That's your right, Whitmore agreed. But I should warn you that federal surveys are rarely overturned. The cost of challenging them is substantial, and the process can take years. In the meantime, Mr. Monroe would be within his rights to pursue legal eviction. How convenient, Eliza said bitterly. This error that stood uncorrected for over a decade suddenly gets discovered right when Harold needs a new weapon against us. Whitmore's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. Discomfort, maybe. Or guilt. I'm simply reporting the findings, Mrs. Turner. What Mr. Monroe does with this information is his business. He left them with copies of the survey maps and a formal notice that they were occupying disputed territory. Caleb stood at the window watching the land agent ride away and felt rage building in his chest, so intense it frightened him. This is fraud, he said quietly. Has to be. Harold paid someone to alter the survey, to create an error that doesn't exist. Can we prove it? Eliza asked. Not easily, Caleb admitted. Survey maps are technical documents. Would take an expert to spot manipulation, and experts cost money we don't have. They were trapped again. Every time they found a way forward, Harold built a new cage. And this cage was the cruelest yet because it used the law itself as the bars. That night, lying in the darkness of the cabin they might lose, Eliza spoke the question they'd both been avoiding. What if we can't win? What if Harold's too powerful, too rich, too connected? Caleb pulled her closer, feeling the steady beat of her heart against his chest. Then we make him pay a price for victory. Even if we lose the land, we make sure everyone knows what he did to get it. We make his name synonymous with cruelty and corruption. We take away the one thing he values as much as power. His reputation, Eliza finished. His reputation, Caleb confirmed. It won't give us back the ranch, but it might stop him from doing this to someone else. But even as he said it, Caleb was forming another plan, a dangerous plan, one that would require risking everything they had left. The next morning, he rode to Copper Creek and sent telegrams to 3 newspapers, not in Denver where Harold had influence, but in San Francisco, Chicago, and New York. Papers that Miss Preston had mentioned, papers that loved stories of frontier injustice. He wrote out the full narrative, the cellar, the forced marriage attempt, the murder of Eliza's mother, the embezzlement, the arson, and now the fraudulent survey. He held nothing back, using names and dates and every detail that might make the story real to readers 1,000 miles away. Then he rode to the telegraph office in the next town over and sent the same messages again, in case Harold had people watching the Copper Creek lines. If Harold wanted war, Caleb would give him war. But it would be fought in the court of public opinion, where money couldn't buy quite as much silence. 3 days later, Harold made his move. He arrived at their cabin with Marshal Henderson, the land agent Whitmore, and legal documents demanding they vacate the property within 48 hours. This is federal land business, Turner, Henderson said, looking miserable. I've got no choice but to enforce it. Based on a fraudulent survey, Caleb said. Prove it's fraudulent, Harold replied, speaking for the first time. His voice was calm, almost pleasant, the voice of a man who'd already won. Bring me evidence that the federal land office is wrong, and I'll withdraw my claim. But until then, you're trespassers on my property, and I want you gone. We'll challenge it, Eliza said fiercely. We'll hire a surveyor. We'll go to court. With what money? Harold asked. From what I hear, you're barely scraping by. A proper survey costs $500. A legal challenge could run into thousands. You can't afford to fight this, and we both know it. He was right, and the knowledge sat like poison in Caleb's gut. They'd survived winter, survived isolation and arson, but they couldn't survive being legally dispossessed of land they'd paid for in good faith. 48 hours, Harold repeated. Then I'll have Henderson remove you by force if necessary. I'm even willing to be generous. I'll buy your remaining property, the acreage that actually belongs to you, for a fair price. $500. Enough to start over somewhere else. Go to hell, Caleb said quietly. Harold's smile was cold. 48 hours, Turner. Use them wisely. They left, and Caleb and Eliza stood in the doorway of the cabin that might not be theirs, looking at the land they'd bled for, the garden Eliza had just planted, the barn they'd rebuilt with their own hands. I won't leave, Eliza said. If Henderson tries to remove us, he'll have to drag me. It won't come to that, Caleb said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. But salvation came from an unexpected source. That evening, as darkness fell and despair settled over them like a shroud, they heard horses approaching, multiple riders coming fast. Caleb grabbed his rifle, prepared for Harold's men returning to force them out early. But when he opened the door, he found Ruth, Dr. Hayes, Reverend Hammond, and 20 other people from Copper Creek and the surrounding ranches. "We heard about Harold's latest scheme," Ruth said without preamble. "We're here to help." "Help how?" Caleb asked, bewildered. "We took up a collection," Dr. Hayes explained, dismounting and pulling a leather pouch from his saddlebag. "Everyone contributed what they could. It's not much, $430, but combined with what you have left from the settlement, it should be enough to hire a proper surveyor." Caleb stared at the money, unable to speak. These people, some of whom he barely knew, some of whom had avoided him during Harold's economic isolation, had reached into their own meager savings to help. "Why?" he finally managed. "Because we're tired of Harold Monroe running this valley like his personal kingdom," said Patterson, the rancher who'd brought lumber during the winter. "Tired of being afraid to speak up, tired of watching good people get crushed because they can't afford to fight back." "Because what's happening to you could happen to any of us," added Mrs. Chen, who ran the laundry. "Today, it's a fraudulent survey. Tomorrow, it might be false accusations or manufactured debts. Someone has to stand up to him." "Because it's right," Reverend Hammond said simply, "and because we should have stood up sooner." Eliza was crying openly now, and Caleb felt his own eyes burning. They weren't alone. They'd never truly been alone. Harold's greatest weapon, isolation, had just been shattered by simple human decency. "There's more," Ruth said. "Judge Morrison is still in the territory. He agreed to hear an emergency petition if we can present evidence of fraud. If we can prove Harold manipulated the survey, he'll issue an injunction stopping the eviction." "We've got less than 48 hours, Caleb said. "Then we'd better work fast," Ruth replied. They worked through the night. Caleb rode to the county seat with the money and hired Edmund Price, the best surveyor in Colorado Territory. Price was expensive, but he was also honest and meticulous, with a reputation for catching fraudulent surveys. He agreed to start immediately, assembling his team and equipment even as Caleb explained the urgency. Meanwhile, Eliza and Ruth went through every document related to the original land sale, looking for inconsistencies or clues. Dr. Hayes and Reverend Hammond rode to neighboring properties, gathering testimony about where boundaries had been understood to be for the past decade. By noon the next day, Price had completed his preliminary survey. He stood in Caleb and Eliza's cabin, spreading his maps across the table with an expression that was equal parts professional outrage and grim satisfaction. "This is fraud," he said flatly. "Whoever filed this corrected survey with the Federal Land Office either didn't know what they were doing or was deliberately falsifying data. The original 1873 survey was accurate. The corner markers are still there, the measurements match historical records, and the creek boundaries haven't changed. This new survey is off by exactly 300 yards, just enough to put your improvements on Monroe's land." "Can you prove it?" Caleb asked. "I can testify to it," Price said, "and I can show any judge with basic geometry skills why this survey is impossible. The corrected version claims a bend in the creek that doesn't exist and hasn't existed in living memory. It's sloppy work, honestly. Whoever Harold paid to do this was either incompetent or assumed no one would check." They had their evidence. Now they needed Judge Morrison to hear it before Harold's deadline expired. They found the judge at Ruth's boarding house, preparing to leave for his next circuit stop. He listened to their urgent petition with the same hard-faced attention he'd given the previous hearings, then nodded once. "I'll hear it," he said. "Tomorrow morning, 8 o'clock, at the courthouse. Tell Monroe to be there with his surveyor and his lawyer. We'll settle this properly." The courthouse was packed the next morning. It seemed everyone in Copper Creek had turned out to watch, along with ranchers from the surrounding valleys. Harold arrived with Whitmore and his lawyer, confident and controlled. But when Edmund Price began his testimony, presenting map after map, measurement after measurement, showing exactly how the corrected survey was mathematically impossible, Harold's confidence began to crack. Judge Morrison asked pointed questions. Whitmore stammered through answers that grew progressively less certain. Harold's lawyer objected repeatedly, but Morrison overruled him each time. Finally, after 3 hours of testimony and cross-examination, Morrison delivered his ruling. "The corrected survey is fraudulent," he announced. "Whether Mr. Whitmore was complicit in the fraud or merely negligent in his duties, I cannot determine without further investigation, but I am issuing an immediate injunction against any eviction proceedings based on this survey. The original 1873 boundaries stand. Mr. and Mrs. Turner's property rights are confirmed." The courtroom erupted in applause. Harold sat frozen, his face white with rage. Whitmore had already slipped out a side door, probably riding for Denver as fast as his horse could carry him. But Morrison wasn't finished. "Furthermore," he continued, raising his voice over the noise, "I am referring this matter to federal authorities for criminal investigation. Falsifying government land surveys is a serious crime, and whoever is responsible will face prosecution." Harold stood abruptly, his lawyer grabbing his arm to restrain him. For a moment, Caleb thought the man might attack the judge physically, but Harold's rigid self-control held. He turned without a word and walked out of the courthouse, leaving his lawyer scrambling to follow. Outside, the town celebrated. People congratulated Caleb and Eliza, thanked Edmund Price, and talked excitedly about finally seeing Harold Monroe held accountable. But Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Harold had lost too completely, too publicly. His reputation was destroyed, his schemes exposed, his power broken. A man like that, with nothing left to lose. "Eliza," Caleb said urgently, grabbing her arm. "Where's Harold now?" She turned to look, scanning the crowd. "I don't see him. He left right after the ruling." Caleb was already running, pushing through the crowd toward their wagon. His instincts were screaming at him, every sense he'd developed over years of surviving danger telling him something terrible was about to happen. They reached their wagon to find one of the wheels had been sabotaged, the axle deliberately weakened. It would have collapsed during the ride home, possibly killing them both, or at least leaving them stranded and vulnerable. "He tried to kill us," Eliza whispered. "Even after losing in court, he tried—" "He's not done," Caleb interrupted. "We need to get back to the ranch, now." They borrowed horses from Ruth and rode hard, taking the direct route through the hills instead of the longer road. Caleb pushed his mount faster than was safe, driven by fear he couldn't name but couldn't ignore. They smelled the smoke before they saw it. The cabin was burning. Not the barn this time, but their home, flames already consuming the roof and walls. And standing in front of it, watching it burn with an expression of terrible satisfaction, was Harold Monroe. Caleb dismounted at a run, but Eliza caught his arm. "Wait," she said urgently. "Look!" Harold wasn't alone. He had a rifle, and he was holding it loosely, almost casually, pointed in their general direction. As they watched, he raised it, aiming at the cabin's door. "He's making sure we can't save it," Caleb realized. "Any attempt to put out the fire, and he shoots." "Or he shoots us," Eliza added. They were too far away for accurate pistol fire, and Caleb's rifle was back in town. They could only watch as their home burned, as everything they'd fought for went up in flames. Harold saw them then. He turned, the rifle still in his hands, and for a moment Caleb was certain the man was going to shoot them. But Harold just stood there, his face a mask of cold triumph. "You took everything from me," Harold shouted across the distance. "My reputation, my business, my future. So I'm taking everything from you. Your home, your land, your life together, all of it burns." "It's just a building, Harold," Eliza shouted back. "We can rebuild. We did it before. We'll do it again." "Not this time," Harold replied. "This time I made sure. The bank in Denver holds a note against your property, $500, due in 30 days. I bought that note this morning, and when you can't pay, and you won't be able to pay after losing everything in this fire, I'll foreclose. The land will be mine, legally and completely. You'll have nothing." It was brilliant in its cruelty. Even if they proved Harold had set the fire, even if he went to jail for arson, the banknote would still exist. They'd still lose the land through legal foreclosure. Harold had created a trap they couldn't escape. But as Caleb stared at their burning home, as he felt Eliza's hand slip into his, he realized something Harold had never understood. "You're wrong," Caleb said quietly, though his voice carried across the meadow. "We'll still have each other, and that's more than you've ever had or ever will have." Something flickered in Harold's eyes. Pain, maybe, or the recognition of a truth he'd spent his whole life denying. For just a moment, standing there with his rifle and his revenge, Harold Monroe looked utterly alone. Then riders appeared on the ridge behind Harold. Caleb recognized Marshal Henderson, accompanied by what looked like federal marshals. Behind them came Ruth, Dr. Hayes,
Edmund Price, and half the town. Harold saw them too. He started to raise his rifle, then slowly lowered it, understanding finally penetrating. He was surrounded, caught in the act, with witnesses everywhere. Henderson dismounted, his face grim. "Harold Monroe, I'm arresting you for arson, attempted murder, and fraud. You have the right to—" Harold didn't wait for the rest. He raised the rifle again, but this time he turned it on himself. "No!" Eliza screamed, starting forward. The shot echoed across the valley, and Harold Monroe crumpled to the ground. The silence that followed was absolute. Then people were running, shouting, trying to help despite knowing it was too late. Dr. Hayes reached Harold first, but even from a distance, Caleb could tell there was nothing to be done. Harold Monroe had taken his own life rather than face the consequences of his actions. Caleb held Eliza as she cried, not for Harold, but for the waste of it all. The years of cruelty, the lives destroyed, the suffering inflicted, all ending in a coward's escape from justice. The cabin burned to its foundation while they stood there, the fire department from Copper Creek arriving too late to save it. But looking at the faces around them, Ruth and Dr. Hayes, Reverend Hammond and Edmund Price, the Pattersons and Mrs. Chen, and dozens of others who'd come to help, Caleb realized they hadn't lost everything. They'd lost a building, but they'd gained a community. The investigation into Harold's affairs took months. Federal authorities uncovered evidence of fraud, embezzlement, and corruption that went back years. Samuel Blackwood, questioned in New York, provided testimony that implicated Harold in schemes across 3 territories. The banknote Harold had threatened them with turned out to be fraudulent, purchased with embezzled funds, and therefore invalid. More importantly, they found proof that Harold had indeed murdered his wife. A diary Margaret Monroe had hidden in the wall of her bedroom, discovered during the estate sale, documented years of abuse and her growing fear that Harold would kill her. The final entry, dated 2 days before her death, read simply, "He knows about the letter to my lawyer. I don't think I'll survive the week." It was too late for justice for Margaret, but her words exonerated her daughter and confirmed everything Eliza had claimed. Harold's estate, when finally settled, was found to be deeply in debt. But buried in his accounts was the original $5,000 from Eliza's trust, barely touched, sitting in an investment account Harold had apparently forgotten about. It was returned to Eliza with interest, nearly $7,000 total. With that money, they rebuilt. Not just the cabin, but a proper house. Not just a barn, but a whole ranch operation. They bought cattle, hired help, and began to build something that would last. But more than that, they built a life. Eliza fulfilled her dream of teaching, opening a small school for valley children in a room they added to the house. She taught reading, writing, arithmetic, and history to anyone who wanted to learn, charging nothing for students whose families couldn't pay. Children came from miles around, and watching her with them, patient, kind, encouraging, Caleb fell in love with her all over again every single day. Caleb built his reputation as a fair rancher and a good neighbor. He helped others the way he'd been helped, providing work to men down on their luck, lending tools and labor during harvests, standing up for those who couldn't stand up for themselves. The ranch prospered not because they were ruthless, but because they were decent. They had children, 3 of them over the years, 2 daughters and a son, each one fierce and stubborn and brave like their mother, each one kind and determined like their father. The valley that had once echoed with screams of desperation filled instead with children's laughter. Ruth remained a constant presence in their lives, becoming grandmother to their children in everything but blood. Dr. Hayes retired and spent his final years teaching the next generation of frontier doctors, including Caleb and Eliza's eldest daughter, who inherited his careful hands and compassionate heart. Reverend Hammond married them again on their 5th anniversary, a proper celebration this time, surrounded by everyone they loved. Marshall Henderson resigned his position after Harold's death and became a rancher himself, proving that even men who'd compromised their principles could find redemption through better choices. The town of Copper Creek grew and changed. New people came, old prejudices faded, and the valley became known not for Harold Monroe's corruption, but for the community that had stood up against it. People told the story of the woman in the cellar and the cowboy who'd saved her, but they told it right, not as a fairy tale of rescue, but as a testament to courage, resilience, and the power of people choosing to do what was right, even when it cost them.
Years later, on a summer evening when the aspens were turning gold and the air smelled of pine and possibility, Caleb and Eliza sat on the porch of their home, the third structure on that spot, built after fire and struggle and triumph, and watched their grandchildren play in the meadow. "Do you ever regret it?" Eliza asked. "That first night, hearing me scream, coming to help a stranger?" Caleb took her hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of 40 years of practice. "Not once," he said honestly. "You?" "Never," Eliza replied. "You saved my life that night, Caleb." "We saved each other," he corrected. "I was lost before I met you, angry, isolated, convinced the world was too broken to fix. You showed me it wasn't. You showed me that standing up matters, that fighting for what's right makes a difference, that love is worth any cost." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sunset paint the valley in shades of amber and rose. The same valley where Eliza had once been imprisoned in darkness now glowed with light. The same mountains that had seemed so lonely when Caleb first arrived now felt like home. Their oldest granddaughter came running up to the porch, breathless and excited. "Grandma, tell us the story, the one about the cellar and Grandpa saving you." Eliza smiled, but it was Caleb who spoke. "It wasn't like that, sweetheart," he said gently. "I didn't save your grandmother. She saved herself. I just had the privilege of helping and the good fortune that she chose to let me stay." "Tell us anyway," the child insisted. "Please?" So Eliza told the story, the real one, without romanticizing the fear or the pain or the desperate choices they'd made. She told about the cellar and the rescue, about the forced marriage that became real love, about the winter they'd barely survived and the fight against a powerful man who'd thought he could break them. She told about how they'd learned that strength isn't about never falling, it's about getting back up. That courage isn't the absence of fear, it's doing what's right despite the fear. That love isn't just passion and poetry, it's choosing each other every single day, through hardship and heartbreak and everything in between. And as the children listened with wide eyes, as the sun set over the valley they'd bled to keep, Caleb Turner looked at his wife and knew with absolute certainty that every struggle, every sacrifice, every terrifying moment had been worth it. They'd started with a scream in the darkness and a stranger's desperate plea for help. They'd built from that foundation a life of purpose, a family of love, and a legacy of standing up when standing up mattered. The cellar that had held Eliza captive was long gone, filled in and forgotten. But the freedom she'd claimed that night, the freedom they'd fought for together, that endured. And in a valley in Colorado, where aspens turned gold and streams ran clear and children played without fear, two people who'd saved each other from loneliness and despair grew old together, surrounded by the life they'd built from courage, conviction, and the simple decision to do what was right. The scream that had shattered the silence all those years ago had led not to death, but to life. Not to despair, but to hope. Not to an ending, but to a beginning that lasted generations. And that, Caleb thought as Eliza's hand tightened in his, and their grandchildren laughed in the fading light, was the only victory that had ever truly mattered.